My oldest son called me at midnight. He works for the FBI. Turn everything off. Go to the attic, lock the door, and do not tell your son-in-law. I whispered that he was scaring me. He shouted at me to just do it. I obeyed. Through a crack in the attic floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It changed everything. My name is Josiah Weaver. I am 69 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday night, I believed my biggest problem was a leaky kitchen faucet. I live a quiet, predictable life in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Atlanta. I drive a weathered 2008 Chevy. To the outside world and to my own daughter, Aaliyah, I am just a retired structural engineer scraping by on a fixed pension. But I have a secret. When my phone rang at exactly 12:14 in the morning, the shrill ringtone shattered the absolute silence. It was my son, Derek. He is a senior special agent for the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We rarely speak this late unless there is a severe emergency. I answered the phone with a groggy voice. Derek did not even say hello. He delivered rapid-fire orders with terrifying urgency. Turn off all the lights right now. Do not make a single sound. Get up to the attic immediately. I asked him what was going on. He cut me off completely. Do not call Aaliyah. Do not call Bradley. Just hide and stay completely silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a terrible family betrayal. I dropped the phone and scrambled out of bed. My joints ached terribly, but pure adrenaline flooded my veins. I grabbed the heaviest metal flashlight I owned and rushed toward the hallway in complete darkness. Before my foot could even hit the bottom step of the pull-down attic stairs, a deafening crash echoed from the front of the house. Someone had just kicked in my heavy oak front door with massive force. Solid wood splintered and shattered across the room. Heavy boots thudded aggressively against the hardwood floor of my living room. I pulled myself up the wooden attic ladder, holding my breath tightly. I pulled the attic hatch shut with a soft click and engaged the heavy steel deadbolt. I lay completely flat on my stomach, pressing my face against a tiny ventilation crack in the floorboards. The cold moonlight filtering through the broken front door illuminated the intruders clearly. There were 3 men standing in my living room. 2 of them were massive, imposing figures dressed from head to toe in black tactical gear. They were holding silenced pistols and moved with military precision. Then the 3rd man stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light. My stomach twisted into a violent knot. It was Bradley Sutton. Bradley is a white corporate lawyer who married my daughter Aaliyah 5 years ago. He has always been an arrogant, boastful man. He wore tailored Italian suits and looked down his nose at my worn-out boots. He constantly treated me like a fragile, obsolete burden who needed to be managed. But right now, he was not wearing his expensive suit. He wore a dark hooded sweatshirt and his face was pale with nervous sweat. He raised a trembling hand and pointed directly toward my master bedroom on the ground floor. He was giving the armed hitmen silent directions to my bed. They clearly thought I was an easy target. They assumed I was just a senile old man sleeping soundly, unaware of the cruel world. But Bradley made a fatal miscalculation. He only saw the old Chevy parked in the driveway and the faded paint on my walls. He did not know anything about my past. I spent 40 years working as a senior structural engineer designing highly secure facilities for government contractors. I know exactly how buildings breathe, and I know how to reinforce them. When I bought this house, I spent 6 months secretly retrofitting this exact attic space. It features reinforced steel joists and military-grade soundproofing. It is a literal fortress disguised as a dusty storage space. And Bradley did not know my other massive secret. He did not know that underneath my modest lifestyle, I hold the core patent for a cybersecurity network system currently valued at $14 million. I deliberately kept my wealth completely hidden from my family. I wanted my children to learn the true value of hard work. I wanted them to build their own successful lives without ever relying on my bank account as a safety net. My humility was meant to teach them character. Instead, it apparently created monsters who viewed me as a worthless financial obstacle to their comfortable lives. Bradley gestured aggressively to the 2 hitmen. He clearly wanted this done fast and clean. I watched the 2 strangers move with terrifying synchronized precision. They did not speak a single word to each other. One of them pulled a small black leather case from his jacket pocket. He opened it slowly and carefully removed a medical syringe. The clear liquid inside gleamed ominously under the pale moonlight. Potassium chloride. It is a deadly chemical compound that causes an immediate and massive heart attack upon injection. It leaves almost no trace in a standard autopsy. The local coroner would simply rule that a 69-year-old man passed away peacefully in his sleep from natural causes, a tragic but completely normal event. Bradley would then play the grieving, supportive son-in-law. He and Aaliyah would clear out my house and inherit my supposed meager savings within weeks without anyone ever asking a single question. The two hitmen crept silently toward the master bedroom door. I watched them push the heavy wooden door open with practiced ease. The hinges were well oiled and made absolutely no sound. Bradley stayed behind in the dark hallway, wiping thick beads of sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He paced back and forth, chewing frantically on his thumbnail. He looked exactly like a desperate man cornered by his own terrible, reckless decisions. From my hidden vantage point, I could see the distinct outline of my bed through the open bedroom door. In my frantic rush to escape upstairs, I had haphazardly tossed the heavy down comforter over a large pile of thick sleeping pillows. In the dark shadows of the room, it formed a very convincing shape. It looked exactly like an adult man sleeping peacefully on his side. The larger hitman approached the edge of the bed with slow, deliberate steps. He raised his silenced pistol, aiming the barrel directly at the head of the shape beneath the blankets. The second hitman stepped forward, holding the deadly syringe. He gripped the plastic needle tightly, preparing to plunge it directly into my neck. He brought his arm down with terrifying, lethal force. The sharp needle pierced the thick fabric of the comforter. Instantly, the hitman froze in his tracks. There was absolutely no physical resistance. There was no pulse and no blood. There was just feathers and soft cotton. He ripped the heavy comforter back, violently exposing the completely empty mattress. The large man cursed under his breath in sheer frustration. He turned quickly to his partner and shook his head violently. The grand deception was instantly exposed. Bradley heard the aggressive rustling and rushed to the bedroom doorway. His eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as he stared directly at the empty bed. He grabbed his own hair and let out a strangled, panicked gasp. He knew his perfect plan had failed miserably. He knew I was still somewhere hiding inside the house. The hitmen immediately raised their weapons and began scanning the room with tactical precision. They checked the dark closet. They checked the master bathroom. They were actively hunting me. My heart hammered violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. I lay completely paralyzed on the dusty attic floor, praying the heavy soundproofing would successfully mask my heavy breathing. But then a sudden bright light flashed deep inside my pocket. My phone screen lit up the pitch-black attic space. A system notification popped up indicating the battery had dropped below 10%. Before I could reach into my pocket to silence the electronic device, the low battery warning triggered a violent mechanical vibration. The phone buzzed aggressively against the solid wooden floorboards. In the absolute dead silence of the house, the buzzing sound amplified like a construction drill. It echoed straight down through the ceiling and directly into the hallway below. Down below, Bradley and the two hitmen froze instantly. The heavy, tense silence was completely shattered by the mechanical hum. The taller hitman slowly turned around. He lifted his silenced pistol and pointed the barrel straight up. Bradley followed his gaze. All three men stood perfectly still, looking directly up at the ceiling, looking exactly where I was hiding. I slammed my thumb down on the power button of my phone, holding it with every ounce of strength I possessed. The screen went completely black, instantly cutting off the mechanical vibration mid-hum. The sudden silence in the house was heavy and suffocating like a thick blanket thrown over my head. Below me, the taller hitman raised his weapon, aiming the heavy black silencer directly at the plasterboard beneath my chest. I stopped breathing entirely. I closed my eyes tightly and waited for the deafening crack of a bullet tearing upward through the floor. But my extreme architectural paranoia saved my life. When I reinforced this attic space 5 years ago, I did not just add steel joists for structural support. I installed a seamless drop ceiling panel mechanism designed to blend flawlessly with the molding. The edges of the trapdoor perfectly aligned with the natural grooves of the hallway trim. To anyone looking up from the ground floor, it appeared to be nothing more than a solid, uninterrupted expanse of white drywall. The hitman squinted into the darkness, scanning the ceiling for any seam or hinge. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps to the left, positioning himself directly under my face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal fighting desperately for survival. I pressed my cheek against the cold, rough wood, refusing to make even the slightest muscular twitch. The second hitman stepped beside his partner, shining a powerful tactical flashlight upwards. The bright, blinding beam swept across the plaster, illuminating the smooth surface. They found absolutely nothing. There was no visible entry point and no sign of a hidden compartment. The taller man lowered his weapon, slowly shaking his head at Bradley. He whispered in a raspy voice that it was probably just an old house settling in the winter cold or a large rat moving inside the walls. They dismissed the sound entirely. The immediate threat of a bullet tearing through my chest faded away, but the nightmare was far from over. Just as the highly trained hitmen lowered their weapons, a sharp, piercing, ringing tone shattered the tense atmosphere in the hallway. It was Bradley's cell phone. He fumbled clumsily in his jacket pocket, his hands slick with nervous sweat, and pulled the glowing device out. He swiped the digital screen and brought it to his ear. He was trembling so violently that his thumb accidentally pressed the speakerphone button. The voice that echoed through the silent house hit me harder than any physical assault ever could. It was Aaliyah. It was my baby girl, the daughter I had carried on my shoulders at the county fair. The little girl who used to fall asleep holding my index finger while I read her bedtime stories. Her voice was sharp, impatient, and completely devoid of any human empathy. She demanded to know if the job was done yet. She practically barked through the phone, asking why it was taking so long to handle one sleeping old man. She complained bitterly that she was sitting in her luxury car 3 blocks away, freezing in the cold and waiting for the signal to come play the grieving, devastated daughter. Bradley stammered pathetically, trying to lower the volume on the device. He whispered frantically that the bed was completely empty, and that I was not in the master bedroom. Aaliyah let out a vicious sound of pure, absolute disgust. She cursed him, calling him an incompetent, weak fool. She told him that if he messed this operation up, the dangerous people he owed money to would not just kill him, but they would come for her too. She ordered him to find me and finish the job tonight without any excuses. The sheer cruelty and raw greed in her tone was paralyzing. I pressed my face harder against the dusty floorboards. I bit down on my lower lip with brutal, punishing force. I bit down until the sharp, metallic taste of warm blood flooded my mouth and dripped down my chin. I did not let out a single whimper. I refused to shed a single tear for a monster. The sharp physical pain in my lip grounded me, keeping my mind razor-sharp and fully alert. I remembered all the immense sacrifices I made after her mother passed away from cancer. The exhausting double shifts at the engineering firm, the scraped knuckles from fixing broken-down cars to save money, the exhausted nights spent helping her with advanced math homework so she could get a college scholarship. I intentionally hid my wealth to protect her from the corrupting influence of unearned money, but the deep greed found her anyway. It consumed her soul entirely. She was no longer my beloved daughter. She was a ruthless predator hunting me for a financial payout. My silence up in the attic was no longer driven by fear or panic. It was driven by a cold, calculated, unyielding rage. The soft, naive father died right there on those dusty wooden floorboards. A new man took his place, a hardened survivor ready to tear their entire world apart piece by piece. Bradley finally managed to take the phone off speaker mode, pressing it tightly to his ear. He promised Aaliyah he would fix the situation immediately. He hung up the phone and shoved it back into his pocket, his chest heaving with sheer panic. The terrifying realization that his perfect plan was collapsing around him pushed Bradley over the edge into sheer violent lunacy. He marched back into my master bedroom like a rabid, desperate dog. He grabbed the heavy oak nightstand next to the bed and hurled it fiercely across the room. It smashed violently against the drywall, shattering the framed glass photograph of my late wife. Pieces of sharp glass and splinters of wood rained down on the hardwood floor. He kicked the mattress with all his might, overturning the heavy wooden bed frame with a loud, echoing crash. He started ripping my closet doors completely off their metal hinges, tearing through my hanging clothes and throwing my shoes aggressively against the window panes. He was completely out of control, breathing heavily and swearing violently into the empty room. The chaotic noise was deafening in the quiet, sleeping suburban neighborhood. The 2 professional hitmen immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bradley firmly by his shoulders. The taller one shoved him incredibly hard against the hallway wall, pinning him there with a forearm pressed against his throat. He spoke in a low, highly dangerous growl. He told Bradley to shut his mouth instantly and stop acting like a pathetic amateur. He reminded the panicked lawyer that my house was located in a densely populated residential area. The violent crashing and the loud breaking glass would easily wake the neighbors sleeping right next door. Someone would definitely call the local police within minutes if the disturbance continued. The hitman stated clearly and coldly that they were paid for a quiet, undetectable medical job, not a messy, noisy, violent crime scene. He declared that the entire operation was officially compromised beyond repair. They were pulling out right now. Bradley tried to argue, pleading with them to search the dark basement or the backyard storage shed. He desperately promised them double the money if they just stayed and finished the contract tonight. The hitmen completely ignored his desperate, sweating pleas. They were hardened professionals who did not take unnecessary fatal risks for a panicking, heavily indebted lawyer. They turned their backs on him in disgust, holstered their silenced weapons smoothly, and walked straight out the broken front door, disappearing seamlessly into the dark, freezing winter night. Bradley was left entirely alone in the devastating wreckage of my master bedroom. He slid slowly down the wall, clutching his head in his trembling hands. He took several deep, ragged breaths, trying to somehow regain his shattered composure. I watched him through the narrow crack in the floor, studying his every pathetic, cowardly movement. He slowly pulled himself up from the floorboards. He muttered out loud to himself, commanding his shaking hands to stop moving. He realized he had to act incredibly fast before I returned from wherever he blindly thought I was currently hiding. He quickly began picking up the shattered glass and righting the overturned heavy furniture. He was going to clean up the entire crime scene and pretend absolutely nothing malicious happened here tonight. I heard him whisper his new, desperate plan into the dark, empty room. He decided he would wait for the sun to come up. When I supposedly walked back through the front door tomorrow morning, he would confront me directly. He would handle the old man himself, right at the breakfast table. He thought he still had the ultimate upper hand. He was dead wrong. I waited in the freezing attic until the morning sun finally began to bleed through the small ventilation slats, illuminating the thick dust dancing in the air. Every single muscle in my 69-year-old body screamed in agonizing stiffness, but my mind had never been sharper or more violently awake. At exactly 7 in the morning, I slowly descended the hidden pull-down ladder and made my way silently to the kitchen. I walked with the slow, measured steps of an unsuspecting old man, completely ignorant of the horrors that had unfolded in his own house just hours before. I noticed the temporary patch job on the front door lock, a pathetic attempt to hide the forced entry. The kitchen smelled strongly of freshly brewed dark roast coffee and expensive citrus cologne. Bradley was already sitting at my small wooden dining table. He was wearing a perfectly pressed navy blue suit, looking exactly like the successful, highly paid corporate lawyer he pretended to the world to be. His hair was slicked back flawlessly, completely hiding the panicked, desperate mess of a man I had watched tearing my bedroom apart in the dark. When he saw me walk into the room, he immediately plastered a wide, overly enthusiastic smile across his face. It was a terrifying mask of pure deceit. "Good morning, Josiah," he said with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. "You are up early today. I was a bit worried when I came by to check on you last night and your bed was completely empty. Where exactly did you disappear to in the middle of the freezing night?" His dark eyes locked onto mine, searching frantically for any sign of suspicion or fear. He gripped his ceramic coffee mug so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He was testing the waters, trying to figure out if his perfect crime was still a viable option, or if I knew the terrible truth about his late-night visitors. I met his probing gaze with absolute, unwavering calmness, refusing to give him a single inch of satisfaction. I poured myself a hot cup of coffee, turning my back to him deliberately to show how completely unbothered and oblivious I was. I told him my arthritis was acting up badly around 2 in the morning, so I simply could not sleep. I explained that I went out to the detached garage at the back of the property to finally fix the carburetor on that old rusty lawnmower. I chuckled softly, adding that old men like me do our best thinking when our hands are covered in thick engine grease. I watched his reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. The immense relief that washed over his pale face was instantly visible. He actually believed my simple, mundane excuse. He truly thought I had been blindly tinkering with spark plugs while armed assassins were hunting me down in my own master bedroom. As I sat down across from him at the table, my phone vibrated twice in my sweatpants pocket. It was a highly encrypted, secure text message from Derek. My son had been working relentlessly through the night, running deep background checks and pulling heavily classified financial records. The digital message was short, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Derek wrote that Bradley was deeply submerged in catastrophic financial ruin. My son-in-law was entirely leveraged and drowning in an active $5 million debt to a ruthless organized crime syndicate operating out of Chicago. He had been borrowing massive sums of illegal money to fund a lavish fake lifestyle and maintain his arrogant corporate image. Now the violent collectors were demanding immediate payment in full. If he did not deliver the $5 million by the end of the week, they were going to brutally murder him. The massive, horrifying puzzle pieces finally clicked together with perfect, devastating clarity. Bradley did not just want my modest brick house. He was actively hunting the hidden $14 million tech fortune he somehow managed to discover. He and Aaliyah planned to forcefully declare me mentally incompetent or simply murder me in my sleep so they could liquidate every single asset I owned to save his pathetic life. My own daughter was willing to sacrifice her loving father to pay off the bloody gambling debts of a cowardly, arrogant fraud. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled deep into my bones, hardening my resolve into unbreakable steel. I looked across the table at the man smiling falsely over his morning coffee. He was not a respected family member anymore. He was a desperate, cornered rat fighting blindly for his miserable survival. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, keeping my face completely blank. He had absolutely no idea that he was sitting across from a man who had already sealed his total destruction. Bradley stood up from the wooden table with sudden, exaggerated energy, clapping his hands together loudly to break the heavy silence. He announced that since we were both up so early, he would gladly make us some fresh, healthy breakfast. He walked over to the marble kitchen counter and pulled a heavy bag of large oranges from the stainless steel refrigerator. I watched him carefully as he grabbed a sharp paring knife and began slicing the fruit with aggressive, rapid movements. He took out the heavy glass juicer and started pressing the oranges manually, putting his entire body weight into the demanding task. His back was turned to me, but I noticed his left hand briefly slip into his tailored suit jacket pocket. When his hand emerged, it hovered quickly over one of the tall crystal glasses he had set on the counter. The movement was incredibly fast, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but I caught the slight unnatural shift in his shoulder posture. He stirred the freshly squeezed orange juice vigorously with a long metal spoon, ensuring whatever powder or liquid he had just dropped into the drink was completely dissolved. He turned around carrying the two glasses with a triumphant predatory smile plastered across his face. He set the fuller glass directly in front of me, sliding it smoothly across the polished wood until it touched my plate. "Drink up, Josiah," he said, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "You need your daily vitamins to stay strong and healthy for us." He sat back down, leaning forward slightly in his chair. He did not reach for his own glass at all. Instead, his dark, calculating eyes remained completely fixed on my face. His gaze was unnerving and intense, locking directly onto my throat, waiting for me to swallow the brightly colored liquid. He was holding his breath, anticipating the immediate biological reaction to whatever lethal substance he had just mixed into my morning drink. He was desperate for this to be over. I slowly wrapped my calloused fingers around the cold, sweating glass. The bright orange liquid sloshed gently against the crystal rim, catching the morning light. I lifted it smoothly off the table, bringing it steadily toward my face. Bradley leaned in even closer, his eyes widening slightly with dark, morbid anticipation. He was practically vibrating with anxious energy, eager to watch me collapse right there on the kitchen floor and finally solve his $5 million problem. He was so close to victory he could taste it. Just as the chilled rim of the glass touched my bottom lip, my phone vibrated violently against my thigh with another urgent incoming alert. The distinct, aggressive buzz was impossible to ignore. I paused, keeping the glass hovering mere millimeters from my mouth, and casually pulled the phone from my pocket with my free hand. It was another encrypted flash message from Derek displaying in bright red text across the locked screen. The urgent warning was short and absolutely terrifying. It read perfectly clearly. "Absolutely do not eat or drink anything he gives you." I stared at the glowing red text on my phone screen. The warning was clear. I looked back up at Bradley. His dark eyes were wide with morbid anticipation, waiting for me to consume the deadly liquid. I needed to act quickly and convincingly. I suddenly let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching my chest with my free hand. I widened my eyes and feigned a violent, sudden muscle spasm in my right arm. My hand jerked forward with aggressive force. The heavy crystal glass slipped entirely from my grip. It crashed violently onto the hard ceramic kitchen floor. The bright orange liquid splashed everywhere, soaking the bottom of Bradley's tailored navy blue suit pants and completely ruining his expensive leather shoes. The glass shattered into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces spreading across the tiles. "Oh my goodness, Bradley, I am so incredibly sorry," I stammered, putting on my best performance of a frail, confused old man. My arthritis just shot a terrible, sharp pain straight up my arm. Bradley jumped back aggressively from the table. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he stared down at the ruined poisoned drink. He was absolutely furious. His hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He wanted to scream at me. He wanted to wrap his hands around my throat and finish the job right then and there. But he was trapped in his own carefully constructed facade. He forced a painfully stiff smile through clenched teeth. He took a deep, jagged breath, trying desperately to conceal his homicidal rage. "It is perfectly fine, Josiah," he hissed, gripping the edge of the marble counter. "It is just juice. I will clean it up immediately." I watched him kneel down onto the wet floor, picking up the shattered glass pieces with trembling, furious hands. His perfect morning assassination plot was completely destroyed by a clumsy old man. A few hours later, the heavy front door swung open. Aaliyah walked into the house just in time for lunch. My 35-year-old daughter looked impeccable, dressed in a high-end designer pantsuit, holding an expensive leather handbag. She walked straight into the living room where I was sitting quietly reading the daily newspaper. She immediately dropped her expensive bag onto the floor and rushed over to my armchair. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder. Within seconds, she began sobbing uncontrollably. It was a spectacular theatrical performance. Her shoulders heaved with heavy, exaggerated breaths. She cried out my name, pulling away just enough to look me directly in the eyes. Her mascara was slightly smudged, giving her the perfect appearance of a devastated, desperate woman. "Dad, I need your help," she cried, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. "Bradley is in terrible trouble. His corporate law firm is facing absolute financial ruin. A major client defaulted on a massive contract, and now the banks are threatening to seize everything we own. We are going to lose our cars, our savings, and our beautiful home." She grabbed my calloused hands, squeezing them tightly. I looked at the daughter I had raised with every ounce of my strength. I remembered working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm just to buy her a new dress for her high school prom. I remembered saving every extra penny so she could attend a prestigious university without drowning in student loans. I purposefully hid my $14 million tech patent wealth so she would never be corrupted by unearned privilege. Yet here she was looking me right in the eye, weaving a fabricated story to steal the very roof over my head. She did not know that Derek had already briefed me on Bradley's $5 million mafia debt. She thought I was completely ignorant. "Dad, there is only one way to save us," she pleaded, her tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "We just need a temporary loan. If you sign the paperwork to mortgage this house, we can secure enough capital to keep the firm afloat. We will pay you back every single penny within 6 months. I swear to you, Dad, it is just a signature to save your daughter from complete bankruptcy." She pulled a thick stack of legal documents from her designer handbag and placed them directly onto my lap. A sleek silver pen was already clipped to the front page. They had prepared everything in advance. They wanted me to sign away my home, the only visible asset they thought I possessed, so Bradley could pay off ruthless killers. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. She was willing to throw her own elderly father out onto the street to save a cowardly criminal. The cold, calculating betrayal hardened my heart permanently. I looked down at the legal papers and then back up into her fake, tear-filled eyes. I slowly picked up the heavy stack of legal documents and placed them firmly onto the coffee table. I looked directly into her eyes and spoke with a calm, unshakable authority. "No, Aaliyah, I will not sign these papers. I will not mortgage the house I worked my entire life to pay off simply to bail out your husband's failing business." The sudden rejection hit her like a physical blow. The fake tears stopped instantly. The vulnerable, desperate daughter vanished, completely replaced by a cold, furious stranger. She stood up abruptly from the sofa, her posture stiff and aggressive. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure resentment. "You are completely unbelievable," she shouted, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet house. "After everything Bradley and I do to check on you, this is how you repay us. You are just a selfish, stingy old man sitting in a decaying house while your own flesh and blood faces financial ruin." She paced furiously across the living room, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "You have always been cheap. You hid your money and forced me to take out loans for my first car. You never helped us build our lives, and now when we actually need you, you turn your back on us." I remained perfectly still in my armchair, letting her hurl her venomous insults. Her true colors were finally on full display. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my decades of sacrifice. She glared at me with absolute toxic hatred. "If you refuse to help us voluntarily, we will find another way," she threatened, her voice dropping to a dangerous, sinister whisper. You are clearly not in your right mind anymore. An old man who refuses to help his own family is obviously suffering from severe cognitive decline. We will take this to court. We will have the state strip you of your financial rights and take control of this estate for your own good." She grabbed her designer bag and stormed out of the living room, her high heels clicking furiously against the hardwood floor. I remained seated listening to her aggressive footsteps march down the hallway. I shifted my gaze slightly toward the open doorway leading to the kitchen. Bradley was standing there leaning casually against the doorframe. He had been listening to the entire heated exchange. A cold, sinister smirk was plastered across his pale face. He was not upset by my firm refusal. In fact, he looked extremely satisfied. Aaliyah's explosive reaction had played perfectly into his ultimate backup plan. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit jacket pocket. He dialed a number he had clearly memorized and raised the device to his ear, keeping his dark, predatory eyes locked onto me. "Yes," Dr. Evans Bradley said into the phone, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "It is Bradley Sutton. We need you to come to the house as soon as possible. My father-in-law has completely lost his grip on reality. He is acting highly erratic and paranoid. We need you to officially evaluate him and process the paperwork for immediate involuntary psychiatric commitment." I did not wait for Bradley to finish his pathetic conversation with his corrupt doctor. I walked right past the kitchen doorway, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I grabbed my worn leather jacket from the coat rack and picked up the keys to my weathered 2008 Chevy. Bradley paused his phone call for a fraction of a second, staring at me with a smug, arrogant grin. He firmly believed I was just an oblivious, frightened old man running away from an uncomfortable family argument to clear my head. He had absolutely no idea I was marching directly toward the ignition switch of his total destruction. I stepped out into the freezing winter air and climbed into the cold driver's seat of my battered truck. The engine sputtered violently before roaring to life a harsh mechanical growl that perfectly matched the cold fury burning in my chest. I backed out of the driveway, leaving my treacherous daughter and her murderous husband inside the house I built. I merged onto the busy Atlanta highway, steering the heavy vehicle toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. My destination was not a police station or a hospital. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the most ruthless, prestigious corporate law firm in the state. I walked past the rows of gleaming luxury sports cars and stepped into the private executive elevator. The doors opened to a sprawling penthouse suite decorated in rich mahogany and imported marble. The young receptionist behind the glowing polished desk looked up, ready to dismiss the elderly man in the faded flannel shirt. But before she could even open her mouth, the heavy oak doors to the corner office swung open. Jonathan Reyes stepped out. He was a legal shark, a man known for tearing multi-billion-dollar corporations to shreds in federal court. When he saw me, his sharp, predatory eyes softened with profound respect. He immediately extended his hand, gesturing for me to enter his private sanctuary. I sank into the deep leather chair across from Jonathan's massive desk. He did not offer empty pleasantries or waste time pouring coffee. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew that my sudden, unannounced presence meant a storm was finally breaking. The world saw me as a retired structural engineer living on a fixed government pension. That was the perfect camouflage. During my 40 years of designing highly secure government facilities, I did not just build physical concrete walls. I engineered the digital structural frameworks that protected their central servers. 15 years ago, I developed and patented a proprietary cybersecurity matrix designed to prevent catastrophic data breaches in major financial institutions. That single piece of highly classified intellectual property is currently valued at $14 million. I retain total ownership of the licensing rights, carefully funneling the massive silent wealth into a heavily guarded offshore holding company. I never touched the money for my own lifestyle. I wanted Aaliyah to earn her own way in the world. But when she married Bradley 5 years ago, I noticed his small independent law firm was bleeding cash. He was an arrogant loudmouth with zero actual business sense. To protect my daughter from his inevitable bankruptcy, I instructed Jonathan to create a blind trust called Vanguard Holdings. For 5 years, Vanguard Holdings has been the anonymous anchor client and silent financial guarantor, keeping Bradley's miserable firm afloat. We pumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into his operating accounts through heavily disguised retainer fees. Bradley strutted around the city wearing tailored suits and boasting about his incredible legal acumen. He truly believed he was a self-made millionaire genius. He was completely unaware that he was surviving entirely on the secret charity of the elderly father-in-law he despised. I looked Jonathan directly in the eyes. My voice was as cold and hard as crushed ice. "The experiment is officially over," I commanded. "He brought armed hitmen into my home last night. He is actively planning to declare me legally incompetent by the end of the day to seize my estate and pay off a $5 million mafia debt." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, lethal intensity. He slowly opened his high-end laptop, turning the screen toward me. He asked for the final confirmation to execute the contingency protocols. I gave a single definitive nod. "Liquidate Vanguard Holdings entirely," I ordered. "Pull every single active retainer. Trigger the immediate clawback clauses on all guaranteed corporate loans. Burn his entire financial empire to the ground right now." Jonathan Reyes typed furiously across his keyboard, his fingers dancing over the keys like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction. He executed the digital commands with absolute surgical precision. It took exactly 47 seconds to completely erase 5 years of Bradley's arrogant illusion. I watched the encrypted banking dashboards on the screen as the massive domino effect initiated. The moment Vanguard Holdings officially withdrew its status as the primary financial guarantor, the automated risk assessment algorithms at Bradley's banks instantly triggered severe red alerts. Without my hidden millions serving as institutional collateral, his corporate firm was immediately flagged as a critical liability. The banking mainframes moved aggressively to protect their own exposed assets. The system automatically executed a total systemic freeze. Every single operating account tied to Bradley's law firm dropped to a functional balance of 0. The corporate credit lines were immediately revoked. But Jonathan did not stop at the business accounts. The clawback clauses I had secretly embedded in the original blind trust documents legally permitted the immediate seizure of his personal assets to cover the defaulted corporate guarantees. The digital shockwave slammed into Bradley and Aaliyah's personal finances. Their joint checking accounts were locked down tightly. Their pristine platinum credit cards, the very same cards they used to fund their lavish vacations and designer wardrobes, were instantly deactivated and permanently canceled. It was a silent, bloodless, absolute massacre, a $14 million hammer crushing a fragile glass house. I sat back in the heavy leather chair watching the final confirmation pop up on the screen indicating the total systemic financial blockade was actively engaged. The entire network of wealth they used to look down on me had vanished into thin air. They were now completely broke, holding millions in debt with absolutely no legal access to a single dime. Across town, completely ignorant of the digital execution that had just occurred, Bradley was sitting in a private booth at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. He was celebrating his incoming victory with the corrupt doctor he had hired to forge my psychiatric evaluation. They were eating premium-aged steaks and drinking incredibly expensive imported wine. Bradley confidently motioned for the waiter, tossing his heavy metallic platinum credit card onto the silver tray with an arrogant flourish. He continued boasting loudly about his brilliant strategic moves. 2 minutes later, the waiter returned to the table looking extremely uncomfortable. He leaned down and quietly informed Bradley that the card had been completely declined. Bradley scoffed angrily, insulting the restaurant's faulty equipment. He aggressively pulled out his backup corporate card and shoved it at the waiter. A minute later, the waiter returned, shaking his head. The secondary card was also rejected. The point-of-sale machine flashed a severe fraud alert code. Bradley's face flushed a deep crimson red in sheer embarrassment. Before he could scream at the staff, his phone vibrated violently on the table. He snatched it up, expecting an automated fraud prevention text from his bank. Instead, he stared at a heavily encrypted message from an untraceable Chicago area code. The message contained a single terrifying sentence. "We know your accounts just froze. You have exactly 12 hours left before we come collect our $5 million in blood." I drove my rusted Chevy back to my modest brick house long before Bradley could even process the magnitude of his financial destruction. I parked the old truck in the driveway and walked inside, stepping carefully over the splintered wood from the broken front door. I resumed my usual position in my worn armchair, holding a faded paperback book and waiting in absolute silence. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable fallout. Less than an hour later, a black luxury sedan practically tore through my quiet residential street, skidding violently across the frost-covered grass of my front yard. The car doors flew open with explosive force. Bradley stormed out, looking completely deranged and broken. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled and his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket was violently wrinkled and stained. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing winter air whipping around him. He grabbed the passenger side door and aggressively yanked a short, balding man out of the vehicle. It was Dr. Evans, the corrupt private physician Bradley had been dining with when his financial empire suddenly evaporated into thin air. Bradley literally dragged the protesting doctor up my front porch steps and kicked my damaged front door wide open with sheer desperate panic. He looked like a wild, cornered animal hunted by invisible predators. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his bloodshot eyes locked onto me sitting calmly in the living room. He marched directly toward my chair, radiating an intense, suffocating aura of fear and violent urgency. The Chicago mafia had given him exactly 12 hours to pay a $5 million debt in blood. His only remaining lifeline in his crumbling world was my house and my supposed meager pension. He needed to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward immediately so he could legally seize control of my entire estate before the sun went down. Bradley stood over me, looming like a desperate tyrant rapidly running out of time. He pointed a shaking, demanding finger at the center of the sofa and ordered me to sit down and cooperate with the medical examination. I slowly closed my paperback book and moved to the couch, playing the role of a confused, intimidated old man perfectly. Dr. Evans stepped forward nervously, setting a heavy black medical bag onto my scratched coffee table. The doctor refused to make direct eye contact with me, adjusting his glasses with slick, sweaty fingers. He pulled out a thick metal clipboard and a silver pen, adopting an overly sweet, condescending tone designed specifically to provoke anger and frustration from an elderly patient. He began asking a rapid succession of deeply insulting and humiliating questions. He asked if I often heard aggressive voices echoing inside the walls of my house at night. He asked if I genuinely believed my own loving family was conspiring to hurt me. He asked if I was prone to violent, unprovoked outbursts or dangerous memory lapses where I forgot my own name. Every single question was a loaded psychological trap meticulously engineered to document severe clinical paranoia and advanced stages of dementia. Bradley paced frantically behind the doctor, rubbing his temples and muttering vicious curses under his breath. He checked his luxury wristwatch every 10 seconds, hyper-aware of the lethal mafia deadline counting down. He interrupted the doctor multiple times, urging him to hurry up and just sign the involuntary commitment papers right now. Bradley aggressively stated to the doctor that I had been wandering the house at night, destroying heavy furniture and accusing my own daughter of terrible crimes. He was shamelessly projecting his own violent, destructive actions from the previous night directly onto me. I sat completely still, enduring their coordinated psychological assault with absolute stoic silence. My unbreakable silence only infuriated Bradley further. He desperately needed me to scream. He needed me to resist physically so Dr. Evans could legally justify using harsh chemical restraints to subdue me. The doctor sighed dramatically, shaking his head in mock pity for the tragic state of my mind. He wrote a few quick, aggressive sentences on his medical pad, claiming that my total unresponsiveness was a clear, undeniable sign of severe catatonic depression, combined with hostile defensive paranoia. He stated aloud that I was in immediate danger to myself and my surrounding family members. The sheer medical corruption unfolding in my living room was sickening, but I remained completely anchored by the absolute certainty of my impending counterstrike. I knew exactly what they were trying to accomplish. They needed to incapacitate me, immediately transport me to a private facility operating on their payroll, and assume total legal guardianship over my life. With legal guardianship, Bradley could instantly liquidate my house and access my bank accounts to pay off the violent criminals hunting him down. He firmly believed my small life savings and the equity in this modest brick property would be just enough to buy him a few more miserable weeks of life. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I held the digital power to buy and sell his entire existence 1,000 times over. The corrupt physician unzipped the main compartment of his black medical bag with a swift, practiced motion. He pulled out a thick glass syringe and a small, sealed vial of clear, viscous liquid. He tapped the glass lightly with his fingernail, preparing a heavy, dangerous dose of a powerful industrial-grade sedative. He informed me with a sickeningly sweet professional voice that he was going to administer a mild relaxant to help calm my frayed nerves before the specialized transport team arrived to take me away. Bradley stopped his frantic pacing and watched with eager, predatory anticipation. He wanted to see me fall unconscious and become completely vulnerable to his greed. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, ready to hold my arms down forcefully if I decided to fight back against the needle. I did not fight. I did not raise my voice or try to push the sharp needle away. Instead, I slowly reached my right hand into the inside breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. Bradley flinched slightly, stepping back as if he anticipated I was pulling out a hidden weapon. But I simply withdrew a crisp, folded piece of heavy stock paper. I calmly unfolded the pristine document and placed it flat on the coffee table right next to the doctor's clipboard and the loaded syringe. The golden embossed seal of the Federal Institute of Health gleamed brightly under the warm living room lights. I told Dr. Evans in a low, commanding voice to read the document carefully before he made a reckless medical decision that would instantly end his professional career and send him directly to federal prison for elder abuse and medical fraud. The doctor paused immediately, his hand hovering in midair with the deadly syringe. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and scanned the official typed document. It was a comprehensive neurological and psychological evaluation conducted just yesterday afternoon by a board of top-tier federal psychiatrists. The strict certification explicitly stated that Josiah Weaver possessed immaculate cognitive function, absolute mental clarity, and zero psychological abnormalities of any kind. The document was legally bulletproof, thoroughly notarized, and carried the absolute highest level of federal medical authority in the country. It rendered their entire fake diagnosis completely worthless and highly illegal. The heavy glass syringe slipped instantly from the doctor's trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden coffee table, rolling against his clipboard. All the color drained completely from Dr. Evans' face, leaving him looking like a terrified, sickly ghost. He realized immediately that he had been manipulated into participating in a highly illegal medical fraud conspiracy against a fully competent, federally protected citizen. Fearing the immediate and permanent revocation of his medical license and severe criminal prosecution, the cowardly doctor shoved his clipboard roughly into his bag and bolted straight for the front door without saying a single word. Bradley yelled desperately for him to stop, reaching out frantically to grab his winter coat, but the terrified physician shoved him aside heavily and sprinted out of the house and down the driveway. The loud slam of the front door echoed through the house with absolute devastating finality. I remained seated peacefully on the sofa, smoothing out the wrinkles in my flannel shirt and looking forward. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the living room, completely alone and devoid of any remaining allies. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate, wet breaths. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes were completely bloodshot, blazing with the feral, unrestrained panic of a dead man walking. Bradley stood entirely alone in the center of my living room, his breathing ragged and incredibly shallow. The heavy front door remained wide open, letting the freezing winter wind howl aggressively through the house, but he did not seem to notice the violently dropping temperature. The ruthless mafia deadline was ticking down relentlessly inside his head. 12 hours. He had less than 12 hours to secure $5 million, or his life was officially over. His perfectly tailored navy blue suit was heavily rumpled, his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. The fake, corrupt doctor had fled, taking Bradley's absolute easiest path to my hidden assets with him. But total desperation breeds a special kind of violent, dangerous insanity. I watched him from the sofa, completely unmoving, as his bloodshot eyes darted frantically around the room before locking intensely onto the closed, solid oak door at the exact end of the hallway. My private home office. I had always kept that specific room strictly off-limits to everyone, including my own daughter, Aaliyah. Bradley knew that long-standing rule. He knew I kept my most important physical legal documents locked away safely inside. He let out a low, guttural growl that sounded far more animal than human. He lunged forward, abandoning any remaining pretense of being a civilized, highly educated corporate lawyer. He sprinted aggressively down the hallway and slammed his right shoulder violently against the locked office door. The solid oak held firm on the first heavy impact. Bradley cursed loudly, backing up and kicking the heavy wood near the brass handle with all his remaining frantic strength. The internal lock mechanism splintered instantly, the wooden doorframe cracking with a loud, agonizing snap. The door swung open, banging aggressively against the interior wall. He stumbled blindly into my private sanctuary, completely consumed by his frantic, chaotic need to find my original last will and testament. He firmly believed that if he could just find and physically destroy my current will, he and Aaliyah would automatically inherit everything as my next of kin under standard state law when he finally decided to murder me. I did not stand up or follow him down the hallway. I simply remained seated peacefully in the living room, listening to the chaotic, loud symphony of destruction echoing clearly from my office. Heavy metal filing cabinets were pulled open with brutal, unforgiving force. Thick stacks of financial paper were thrown carelessly onto the polished hardwood floor. Bradley was tearing my personal sanctuary apart, looking desperately for his immediate financial salvation. What he completely failed to understand was that my actual immense wealth, the $14 million technology patent, and the vast offshore holding accounts were legally insulated by a massive, complex labyrinth of airtight corporate blind trusts that he could never possibly penetrate. However, I had intentionally left a specific, highly important document inside the heavy steel floor safe tucked securely beneath my large mahogany desk. It was a perfectly executed piece of psychological bait. Bradley was a man who lived his entire adult life exploiting minor loopholes and manipulating dense legal jargon. He prided himself heavily on being the smartest, most capable man in any given room. He constantly mocked my simple, quiet lifestyle, openly laughing at my rusted Chevy truck and my faded flannel shirts. He built his entire fragile, arrogant ego on the false belief that he was inherently superior to a retired structural engineer. His massive, blinding arrogance was exactly what shielded him from seeing the lethal trap I had carefully laid. I heard the loud, metallic clanging of his expensive leather shoes kicking the heavy steel safe in sheer frustration. I knew he was currently sweating profusely over the digital keypad. He did not know the secret combination, but his wife Aaliyah certainly did. She had watched me open it several years ago. I heard him frantically dialing her cell phone number, demanding she give him the 6-digit access code immediately. Seconds later, a loud electronic beep echoed down the hall, confirming the safe was finally unlocked. The heavy steel door creaked open slowly. Bradley let out a triumphant, breathless gasp. He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope from the very bottom of the cold metal box. He ripped the heavy paper open with shaking, intensely greedy fingers. He was absolutely certain he was holding the master key to my entire remaining estate. He pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy parchment paper. It was a handwritten, legally notarized last will and testament. I had drafted it precisely for this exact, devastating moment. Bradley scanned the legal text, his dark eyes darting frantically across the elegant cursive handwriting. He fully expected to see Aaliyah listed as the primary sole beneficiary. He expected to see full, unrestricted control of my assets transferred directly to his wife. Instead, his eyes locked onto the final, unyielding legal clause at the bottom of the page. The document explicitly stated that upon my death, every single physical asset, property, and liquid fund under my name would be immediately and irrevocably donated to a federal wildlife conservation charity. My treacherous daughter and her criminal husband were entirely cut out of the estate. They were explicitly left with absolutely nothing but zero balances. A profound, heavy, devastating silence settled over the ruined office. The harsh reality of the document crushed the very last ounce of hope out of his miserable, panicked existence. The $5 million mafia debt suddenly felt like a massive physical weight pressing down hard on his chest. He was completely out of options and entirely out of time. The deafening silence in the office was suddenly broken by a primal, violent scream of absolute, pure fury. Bradley lost every single shred of his remaining sanity in that very moment. He gripped the heavy parchment paper in his trembling, sweating hands and tore it viciously right down the middle. The sharp, violent ripping sound echoed loudly down the hallway, reaching my ears perfectly. He did not stop there. He stacked the torn halves together and ripped them aggressively again and again. His pale face was twisted into an unrecognizable, ugly mask of pure, raw hatred. He reduced the highly important, legally binding document to dozens of tiny, jagged pieces of completely useless confetti. He threw the shredded paper aggressively into the air, letting the white flakes rain down heavily over my scattered office files and the overturned furniture. But simply tearing the document into pieces was not enough to satisfy his violent, destructive rage. He needed to ensure the will was completely obliterated from existence, so no forensic team could ever piece it back together. He quickly spotted a heavy crystal glass ashtray sitting on the far corner of my mahogany desk. He frantically swept the shredded pieces of parchment into the deep glass bowl with his bare hands. He reached hurriedly into his tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out an expensive silver butane lighter. He flicked the metal wheel with a shaking, desperate thumb. A bright, hot orange flame erupted instantly in the dim room. Without a single second of hesitation or rational thought, Bradley touched the hot flame directly to the pile of torn paper. The dry, aged parchment caught fire instantly. Bright yellow and orange flames licked the air rapidly, consuming the black ink and the paper in a localized, aggressive blaze. Thick gray smoke began to curl rapidly toward the ceiling, carrying the bitter, acrid smell of burning paper out into the hallway. Bradley stood motionless over the burning bowl, watching the hot flames reduce his final financial obstacle to dark gray ash. A sickening, twisted, triumphant smile slowly crept across his sweating face. He actually believed he had finally won the war. He firmly thought that by burning this single piece of paper, he had successfully rewritten his own legal fate. He thought the probate law would now automatically default to his wife and save his pathetic life from the violent mafia collectors. He was entirely oblivious to the lethal digital surveillance net closing tightly around his throat. Through the thick rising smoke, a tiny pinpoint of red light blinked silently in the dark corner of the office. Tucked discreetly inside the hollowed-out eye of a golden engineering trophy resting on the highest wooden bookshelf, a miniaturized high-definition surveillance camera captured every single frame of his felony. The steady blinking red light recorded his violent break in the aggressive tearing of the legal document and the deliberate, highly illegal act of arson. My phone vibrated softly in my shirt pocket, breaking my intense, calculated focus. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a direct, encrypted call from Derek. I answered it, bringing the secure device quietly to my ear. My son's voice was ice-cold and perfectly steady. He confirmed that the federal servers had just securely uploaded the entire live digital feed from the hidden trophy camera. Derek stated clearly and confidently that they now possessed undeniable high-definition video proof of severe property destruction, felony tampering with official legal documents, and attempted domestic arson. We had absolutely everything we needed. The steel trap had successfully snapped shut. I ended the encrypted call with Derek feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction. The trap had successfully closed around Bradley's neck, but the financial execution was only half of my overall strategy. The other half involved dismantling the toxic alliance between my greedy daughter and her cowardly husband. I stood up from my armchair and walked silently up the carpeted stairs toward the guest bedroom where Aaliyah and Bradley occasionally stayed during their manipulative visits. The house was completely quiet except for the faint sound of Bradley frantically trying to clean up the ashes in my destroyed office downstairs. He was far too preoccupied with his imaginary victory to notice my movements. I slipped quietly into the pristine guest room. The air smelled strongly of Aaliyah's expensive designer perfume, a scent bought and paid for by the very blind trust I had just eradicated. I approached the elegant oak vanity table situated near the large bay window. From the inner pocket of my flannel shirt, I withdrew a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Derek had securely couriered this specific package to me earlier in the week, containing highly classified financial intercepts gathered by his FBI division. I placed the heavy envelope squarely in the center of the polished wooden vanity mirror, ensuring it would be the absolute first thing Aaliyah saw when she returned to the house. There was no return address and no handwriting to identify the sender. It was a perfectly anonymous, explosive device primed and ready to detonate their fragile marriage. I smoothed my hand over the thick paper one last time, adjusting it so the edges aligned perfectly with her expensive makeup brushes. I turned around and walked out of the room, shutting the door softly behind me. The stage was set for their mutual destruction. Less than an hour later, I heard the heavy front door open and close. Aaliyah had returned from her supposed frantic errands, likely trying to secure a predatory loan against my house behind my back. Her high heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floors as she marched directly upstairs to the guest bedroom to freshen up. I sat in the living room, listening intently to the muffled sounds above me. I heard the distinct rustle of heavy paper tearing open. Then a sudden, suffocating silence fell over the second floor. Up in the bedroom, Aaliyah was staring down at a meticulously documented trail of ultimate betrayal. Inside the anonymous envelope lay a stack of high-resolution printed bank statements and luxury retail receipts. The topmost document was a confirmed booking itinerary for a first-class, one-way flight departing from Atlanta International Airport directly to Geneva, Switzerland. The departure date was set for exactly 2 days from now. The passenger name printed in bold black ink was Bradley Sutton. There was no second ticket purchased for his wife. He was planning to abandon her entirely to face the violent mafia debt collectors alone. But the airline ticket was not the only devastating piece of evidence. Beneath the flight itinerary was a verified purchase receipt from an exclusive diamond jeweler located in the downtown financial district. The receipt detailed the cash purchase of a flawless $80,000 platinum and diamond pendant necklace. Attached to the receipt was a printed email exchange revealing the intended recipient. It was not a grand romantic gesture to apologize to his wife for their impending financial ruin. The necklace was purchased for a 24-year-old junior paralegal working at Bradley's law firm. The email contained sickeningly sweet promises of a new wealthy life together in Europe once he liquidated his crazy father-in-law's estate. Aaliyah was a woman driven entirely by status, wealth, and her arrogant perception of absolute control. She had willingly conspired to murder her own elderly father simply to maintain her lavish country club lifestyle. She tolerated Bradley's unbearable arrogance because she firmly believed they were equal partners in their dark criminal enterprise. Seeing the cold, hard, undeniable proof that her husband viewed her as nothing more than a convenient disposable pawn broke her fragile narcissistic mind. He was using her to legally secure my house and my life savings to pay off his massive underground debts, and then he planned to vanish across the globe with a younger woman. The sheer magnitude of his disrespect completely shattered her delusional reality. I heard a low guttural shriek echo from the second floor, a sound of pure, unadulterated feminine rage. Heavy footsteps pounded aggressively down the wooden staircase. Aaliyah descended like an absolute hurricane of fury, clutching the crumpled documents tightly in her shaking fists. Her face was flushed a deep, violent crimson, and her eyes burned with a manic, homicidal intensity. She stormed past the living room, completely ignoring my presence, and marched directly toward the hallway leading to my ruined home office, where Bradley was still desperately trying to hide the ashes of my destroyed will. The fragile alliance of convenience and greed that held their miserable marriage together had instantly vaporized. They were two cornered predators locked inside a cage, and they were about to turn their sharpest fangs entirely on each other. Bradley barely had time to turn around from the shattered office door before Aaliyah launched herself at him with terrifying ferocity. She swung her arm with maximum leverage, delivering a brutal open-handed slap directly across his face. The loud, sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoed violently through the entire house. Bradley stumbled backward, crashing heavily into the wooden doorframe, clutching his stinging cheek in absolute shock. Before he could utter a single word of defense, Aaliyah hurled the crumpled flight itinerary and the diamond receipt directly at his chest. She screamed at the top of her lungs, asking how he dared to plan a secret escape to Switzerland with his cheap young secretary while she was busy doing all the dirty work to steal her father's estate. Bradley looked down at the scattered documents, his eyes widening in sheer absolute panic. He realized instantly that his ultimate exit strategy was completely exposed. He tried to stammer a pathetic legalistic excuse, claiming the documents were completely fabricated by my lawyers to divide them. Aaliyah refused to listen to a single lie. She shoved him aggressively by the shoulders, screaming that he was a pathetic, cowardly failure who could not even successfully orchestrate a simple lethal injection the night before. Bradley's fragile ego finally snapped under her relentless verbal assault. He shoved her back aggressively, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure resentment. He shouted that she was the one who failed to manipulate her stupid old father into signing the mortgage papers, forcing him to take desperate, violent measures. They screamed vicious insults over each other, completely tearing apart every single lie their marriage was built upon. They blamed each other for the botched assassination attempt, the freezing bank accounts, and the total collapse of their criminal empire. The house vibrated with their toxic screaming, revealing the absolute worst depths of their blackened souls. The explosive argument reached a violent boiling point. Bradley realized he had absolutely no more leverage and no more time. The 12-hour mafia deadline was rapidly approaching its fatal end. He grabbed Aaliyah by the collar of her expensive designer jacket and shoved her violently backward. She tripped over the edge of the hallway rug and fell hard onto the solid wooden floor, gasping for air. Bradley sneered down at her with absolute venomous disgust, declaring that she was entirely on her own now. He turned around aggressively and sprinted out the front door, abandoning his wife without a single ounce of hesitation. Aaliyah sat on the cold floor, sobbing hysterically among the scattered documents. Her trembling hands brushed against the final page of the FBI intercept file that had slipped out of the envelope. It was a highly classified financial guarantor agreement signed with the Chicago crime syndicate. She read the bold print and stopped breathing entirely. Bradley had cleverly forged her signature on the underworld contracts. The $5 million blood debt was legally guaranteed entirely under her name. Aaliyah sat frozen on the cold hardwood floor, staring blankly at the highly classified financial guarantor agreement. The devastating reality of the criminal contract crushed the remaining breath from her lungs. Bradley had legally bound her to a $5 million blood debt with a ruthless Chicago crime syndicate. She was entirely alone and actively hunted by murderers. The violent realization snapped her out of her shock. She dropped the forged documents and scrambled frantically across the hallway carpet. She crawled on her hands and knees directly toward the living room where I remained seated in my armchair. She threw herself at my feet, burying her tear-stained face into my knees. She gripped the fabric of my worn denim jeans with desperate, trembling fingers. "Dad, you have to save me!" she sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "He tricked me. Bradley set me up and left me here to die. You have to help me pay them off. We can mortgage the house today. We can empty your retirement accounts. I will do anything you ask. I was a fool to trust him, but I am still your little girl. Please do not let them kill me." She wept loudly, trying to play the tragic role of the naive, betrayed wife who had simply been manipulated by a cruel husband. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, expecting to see the soft, forgiving father she had exploited for 35 years. I looked down at her tear-streaked face with absolute, dead, unfeeling eyes. There was not a single ounce of warmth or parental compassion left in my heart. The deep, unconditional love I once held for my only daughter had been completely eradicated, burnt to ash by her own treacherous greed. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not stroke her hair or offer empty reassurances. I sat perfectly still, resembling a cold stone statue. "You are not a victim, Aaliyah," I said, my voice dangerously low and entirely devoid of emotion. "You are facing the exact consequences of your own monstrous choices. I spent decades breaking my back to give you a life of privilege. I worked brutal 80-hour weeks at the engineering firm, breathing in toxic concrete dust and freezing in the winter winds just to ensure you never lacked a single necessity. I wore shoes with holes in the soles so I could afford to buy you designer prom dresses and pay for your advanced placement tutors. I built my entire existence around your success and your happiness." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the weight of my words. "And how did you repay a lifetime of sacrifice? You married a loudmouth corporate fraud and suddenly looked at me like I was a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of your expensive high heels. You mocked my modest brick house. You rolled your eyes at my rusted truck. You genuinely believed my simple lifestyle was a personal insult to your newly acquired fake country club status. I intentionally hid my wealth to protect your character, but the rotting greed inside your soul festered anyway. You did not just want my money, Aaliyah. You wanted me dead. You were entirely willing to sacrifice my life so you could continue wearing diamond necklaces and taking luxury vacations funded by mafia loans." Aaliyah shook her head violently, refusing to accept accountability. "No, Dad, that is a lie," she pleaded, her voice rising in a frantic, desperate pitch. "I never wanted to hurt you. It was all Bradley. He poisoned my mind. He made all the plans. I never wanted you to die. I swear on my life I never wanted any of this to happen. I am innocent." Without breaking eye contact, I slowly reached into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I pulled out my digital smartphone, the device synced directly to the hidden recording equipment in the guest bedroom. I did not argue with her pathetic, fabricated excuses. I simply tapped the screen and pressed the play button. The volume was set to maximum. The crystal-clear audio recording of her own voice from the previous night echoed violently through the quiet living room. The recording captured her vicious, impatient phone call to Bradley while the armed hitmen were actively hunting me in the dark. Her digital voice snarled aggressively through the speaker, demanding to know why it was taking so long to handle one sleeping old man. The recording played her ruthless complaint about freezing in her luxury car while waiting to play the grieving daughter. It broadcasted her exact, horrific threat, ordering Bradley to finish the job without excuses so they could collect my estate. I pressed pause. The sudden silence was absolutely deafening. Aaliyah froze completely. The fabricated tears stopped instantly, drying up on her pale cheeks. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed, trapped in the inescapable prison of her own recorded words. She could not utter a single lie to counter the devastating auditory proof of her own homicidal malice. I grabbed her wrists with a firm, unyielding grip and forcefully peeled her trembling hands off my legs. I pushed her away roughly, stepping back to tower over her pathetic, trembling form. "The most pitiful creature in this world is not a person living without money," I stated with absolute chilling finality. "The most pitiful creature is a person who eagerly sells their own soul to acquire it. You sold yours, Aaliyah, and now the devil has come to collect his due." Before she could even attempt to formulate another miserable lie, a massive, violent crash shook the entire front of the house. Someone was pounding aggressively on the splintered wood of the front door with the force of a heavy steel battering ram. The wood groaned and cracked under the immense pressure. Heavy, angry voices shouted demanding entry. The 12-hour deadline had not yet expired, but the Chicago mafia syndicates did not play by the rules of civil society. They had tracked down the sole remaining legal guarantor of their $5 million blood debt, and they had officially arrived to collect. The violent pounding on the front door reached a deafening crescendo. The compromised wood frame simply could not withstand another massive impact. With a sickening loud crack, the heavy oak door completely shattered inward, ripping the deadbolt entirely out of the plaster wall. Freezing winter wind rushed into the hallway, accompanied by two towering figures in dark, tailored overcoats. They did not look like the silent tactical assassins from the night before. These men were brutal, high-level enforcers for the Chicago syndicate. Between them, they dragged a limp, pathetic weight. It was Bradley. His expensive custom suit was torn to shreds, and his face was a swollen, bloody mess. They dragged him effortlessly across the threshold and tossed him violently onto the living room rug right next to his weeping wife. Bradley groaned in absolute agony, spitting a mouthful of dark crimson blood onto the polished floorboards. Aaliyah scrambled backwards, screaming in sheer terror at the sight of her mutilated husband. The lead enforcer, a man with cold, dead eyes, stepped forward and looked down at the pathetic couple. He did not yell or brandish a weapon. His voice was terrifyingly calm and entirely businesslike. He stated that Bradley had tried to run to the international airport like a coward. The syndicate did not appreciate rats who tried to skip out on a $5 million debt. The enforcer pulled a sleek silver phone from his coat, displaying a digital countdown. He announced that their initial grace period was officially revoked. They now had exactly 12 hours to wire the entire $5 million to a secure offshore account. If the money was not confirmed by sunrise, they would return to burn the house down to the ground with everyone locked inside. The two men turned around and walked out the shattered door, leaving the chilling ultimatum hanging heavily in the freezing air. The sound of the syndicate vehicle tires screeching away down the suburban street faded into the dark winter night. The heavy, suffocating reality of their impending doom settled over the ruined living room. Aaliyah sat completely paralyzed in the corner, wrapping her arms around her knees and sobbing hysterically into her designer sleeves. Bradley slowly pushed himself up from the blood-stained rug. He wiped his swollen jaw, wincing in intense pain as his fingers brushed against a deep purple contusion. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. The absolute terror of his imminent, brutal death fundamentally changed him right in front of my eyes. The arrogant, smooth-talking corporate lawyer was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate, rabid animal stripped of all basic human decency. His survival instinct kicked into a violent overdrive fueled by raw adrenaline and blinding panic. He turned his bloodshot eyes toward me. The fear in his gaze rapidly morphed into a dark, homicidal rage. He reached behind his back and pulled a heavy black semi-automatic pistol from the waistband of his trousers. The metallic click of him racking the slide echoed sharply, cutting straight through Aaliyah's pathetic sobs. He marched aggressively toward my armchair. He raised the weapon and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of my forehead. He was no longer trying to hide behind forged medical documents or fake psychiatric evaluations. The time for clever legal manipulation and backdoor fraud had completely run out. This was an armed robbery and a desperate, violent hostage situation. He screamed at me, his voice cracking with wild hysteria. He demanded that I hand over every single asset I owned. He knew I had a lifelong retirement fund. He knew the brick house was fully paid off. He demanded that I liquidate everything immediately to save his miserable life. I stared straight down the barrel of the loaded gun, feeling the cold metal pressing uncomfortably hard into my skin. I did not flinch or break eye contact. The immense pressure of the moment was designed to break me, to reduce me to a begging, frightened old man. But I had spent decades engineering structures designed to withstand massive, catastrophic pressure. Bradley was nothing more than a minor structural stress test. I looked at the pathetic, trembling man holding the gun. He was sweating profusely, his hands shaking so violently the barrel tapped rhythmically against my skull. He threatened to blow my brains out right there in the living room if I did not cooperate. He claimed he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He was right about that. He had already lost his firm, his reputation, and his freedom. But he was severely underestimating the man sitting calmly in the armchair. He thought he was intimidating a weak elderly pensioner. He had no idea he was threatening a man who held the digital keys to a $14 million financial fortress. Bradley grabbed me roughly by the collar of my flannel shirt and yanked me forcefully to my feet. The sudden violent movement sent a sharp jolt of pain through my arthritic knees, but I forced myself to remain completely steady and perfectly upright. He shoved me aggressively down the hallway toward my damaged home office, pressing the gun barrel hard into my lower spine. Aaliyah scrambled to her feet and followed us blindly, her expensive high heels crunching over the broken wood and shattered glass littering the floor. She did not try to stop him or plead for my life. She just watched in terrified silence, hoping my money would somehow buy her safety. We entered the office where the dark ashes of my decoy still sat untouched in the crystal bowl. Bradley shoved me hard into the heavy leather desk chair. He grabbed my personal laptop from the mahogany desk and slammed it down roughly in front of me. He flipped the screen open and ordered me to turn it on immediately. He demanded that I log directly into my primary banking portals right now. He wanted me to initiate a priority wire transfer, draining every single cent of my lifelong retirement savings and taking out an instant digital line of credit against the equity of the house. He leaned over my shoulder, breathing heavily into my ear, his hot breath smelling of copper and raw fear. He barked harsh instructions demanding I route all the available funds directly into the offshore account number the syndicate enforcer had just provided. He genuinely believed that combining my modest pension savings and the liquid equity of my brick house would somehow scrape together enough capital to buy him a brief extension on his $5 million execution order. He was entirely willing to leave me completely destitute out on the street to buy himself a few more days of breathing. During the chaotic home invasion the night before, I had rushed up the pull-down ladder to hide in the heavily soundproofed attic. I had evaded the armed hitmen by pressing my face against the dusty floorboards and holding my breath in the dark. But tonight, the dynamics of the battlefield had entirely shifted. I was not going to run or hide from this desperate, bleeding coward. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, staring calmly at the glowing login screen of the laptop. The heavy black gun barrel remained pressed tightly against the side of my head, a constant deadly threat. I slowly raised my calloused hands and placed my fingers deliberately on the keyboard. I did not beg for my life or try to reason with his violent madness. I simply looked at the bright digital display and began to type. My hands were completely steady without a single visible tremor. I calmly entered a highly complex encrypted password into the secure portal, initiating a financial chain reaction that he could never possibly comprehend. I stared directly at the glowing digital dashboard of my highly secure banking portal. The heavy steel barrel of Bradley's semi-automatic pistol remained pressed firmly against my right temple. The cold metal was grinding painfully into my skin, but I refused to show any sign of physical discomfort. His ragged, erratic breathing washed over my neck, carrying the sharp metallic scent of his fresh blood mixed with the sour stench of absolute panic. I did not hesitate for a single second. My calloused fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a man who had spent 4 decades writing incredibly complex structural code. I entered the final 16-digit alphanumeric authorization sequence and firmly pressed the Enter key. The high-definition screen transitioned instantly. A bright green confirmation bar appeared boldly across the digital display, reading, "Transaction successful, $5 million transferred." Bradley let out a massive explosive gasp of profound relief. He practically ripped the laptop screen closer to his bruised face, his bloodshot eyes frantically devouring the digital confirmation receipt. The heavy pistol slowly pulled away from my skull as all the violent adrenaline and tension drained rapidly from his exhausted, trembling body. He began to laugh. It started as a low, wet, erratic chuckle and rapidly escalated into a full manic, hysterical roar. He threw his head back, laughing loudly at the ceiling like a completely deranged madman who had just successfully cheated death. He turned aggressively toward Aaliyah, who was still cowering near the broken office doorway, and shouted that they were completely saved. He boasted wildly that he had successfully beaten the ruthless syndicate and that my life savings had just bought them a brand new slate. He was absolutely drunk on his own delusional victory. He genuinely believed he had forced a helpless old man to surrender everything. He thought he was back in absolute control. He had no idea he had just blindly walked into a digital slaughterhouse. Bradley was merely a slick corporate lawyer who understood paper contracts and basic escrow accounts. He possessed absolutely no real comprehension of high-level cybersecurity architecture. He arrogantly assumed I was simply liquidating a standard retirement fund into the specific offshore routing number the mafia enforcer had provided. But the highly classified digital infrastructure I had built for the federal government was engineered specifically to intercept, redirect, and analyze illicit financial flows. I did not touch a single cent of my personal pension or the physical equity of my brick house. Instead, I had securely accessed the frozen central ledger of Vanguard Holdings, the massive blind trust I used to secretly fund his pathetic law firm for 5 years. I temporarily unblocked exactly $5 million of my own hidden wealth for one highly specific surgical strike. But I did not wire that money to the intermediary Cayman Islands shell account Bradley intended to use to wash the funds before presenting them to the mob. I executed a sophisticated hard-coded network override. I bypassed his greedy digital hands entirely. Using the primary routing data he forced me to input, I initiated a rapid reverse trace through the dark web financial nodes, successfully identifying the ultimate destination account of the Chicago syndicate boss. I routed the massive electronic transfer directly to the mob boss under Bradley's name, but strictly bypassing his personal control. I essentially paid his blood debt directly to the apex predator. However, paying the criminal debt was never my primary intention. The $5 million was merely an elaborate Trojan horse. I needed a verified, massive financial transaction to serve as the perfect delivery mechanism for a much deadlier digital payload. Over the past 3 years, Derek and his specialized FBI financial crimes unit had been meticulously tracking Bradley's corporate operating accounts. They discovered that Bradley was not just borrowing money from the mafia to stay afloat. He had been actively skimming heavily from their laundered funds. He had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the syndicate, channeling the stolen capital through fake legal retainers to secretly fund Aaliyah's diamond necklaces and his own luxury sports cars. I took that comprehensive FBI digital dossier containing every forged ledger, every secret shell company, and every single stolen dollar, and I embedded it directly into the encrypted metadata of the $5 million wire transfer. The exact moment the money cleared the Chicago boss's offshore account, the digital file was programmed to automatically unpack itself. It was designed to display the undeniable mathematical proof of Bradley's 3-year-long theft directly onto the syndicate's primary private servers. I did not just pay his outstanding debt. I delivered his absolute non-negotiable death warrant, wrapped perfectly in $5 million. Bradley's loud, manic laughter began to subside as he wiped a thick mixture of cold sweat and dried blood from his bruised forehead. He holstered the heavy black pistol carelessly into the waistband of his ruined trousers, feeling entirely invincible. He eagerly pulled his expensive smartphone from his torn suit pocket to verify the incoming deposit. He opened his secure offshore banking application, fully expecting to see a massive digital balance that he could subsequently transfer to the syndicate while keeping a comfortable hidden margin for his own eventual escape. He tapped the refresh icon with a bloody thumb. The circular loading animation spun for 2 agonizing seconds before displaying the total available balance, $0.00. Bradley frowned deeply, tapping the glass screen aggressively. He muttered a harsh, violent curse, assuming the international banking network was simply experiencing a minor delay. He refreshed the application again. The screen blinked and reloaded rapidly. The balance remained absolutely empty. A dark, chilling shadow of profound confusion crept across his bruised, swollen face. He looked up from his phone and stared blankly at the laptop screen still sitting open on my mahogany desk. He finally took the time to read the detailed transaction receipt I had deliberately left visible. He saw the direct routing path. He saw that the massive sum of money completely bypassed his intermediary shell accounts and went straight into the core accounts of the Chicago syndicate. And then his dark eyes locked onto the small digital attachment icon located at the very bottom of the confirmation page. The compressed file name was explicitly titled Sutton Embezzlement Records. He stared at those 3 devastating words as all the remaining color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fresh corpse. He realized exactly what I had attached to the multi-million-dollar transfer. I looked up at him, maintaining my cold, unwavering posture. I told him calmly that he was officially a dead man walking. The syndicate now possessed undeniable documented proof that he had been actively stealing their laundered money for 3 consecutive years. The heavy, suffocating silence in the ruined office was absolute and terrifying. Bradley stopped breathing entirely. His fragile, arrogant mind fractured completely under the sheer crushing weight of his catastrophic reality. He had inadvertently forced me at gunpoint to send his most dangerous, ruthless enemies the exact, undeniable evidence required to justify his immediate, brutal execution. He opened his swollen mouth to speak, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by sheer, overwhelming terror. Right at that exact devastating second, his smartphone vibrated violently in his trembling, sweaty palm. A harsh, aggressive ringtone pierced the quiet room, echoing off the walls. Bradley slowly lowered his terrified eyes to the glowing digital screen. The caller identification displayed a restricted Chicago area code. It was the syndicate boss calling directly to discuss the newly acquired digital dossier. The remaining physical strength evaporated completely from Bradley's legs. His knees buckled slightly. His hand shook so violently that his fingers simply gave out. The heavy black pistol slipped completely from his waistband, sliding rapidly down his leg. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp clatter, stopping right next to his feet. The ringing of the smartphone on the hardwood floor sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ruined home office. Bradley stared down at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake coiled and ready to strike. The caller identification boldly displayed the restricted Chicago area code. He was completely paralyzed, incapable of making a single voluntary movement. I looked down at him from my leather chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed and authoritative. "Answer it," I commanded, my voice echoing with icy, absolute authority. "Answer it and put it on speaker so we can all hear the consequences of your greed." Bradley hesitated, his entire body trembling violently, but the fear of ignoring the call outweighed his fear of answering it. He slowly reached down with a shaking, bloody hand and swiped the green icon across the cracked glass. He tapped the speakerphone button and dropped the device back onto the floorboards. A low, gravelly voice filled the room. It was not a loud, angry shout, but a terrifyingly calm, methodical rasp that conveyed absolute lethal power. The syndicate boss did not introduce himself. He simply stated that he had just received a very generous $5 million deposit, along with a highly entertaining digital reading assignment. The boss explained in a chillingly smooth tone that he had spent the last 10 minutes reviewing the meticulously documented embezzlement files I had attached to the wire transfer. He noted every single fake legal retainer, every shell company, and every stolen dollar that Bradley had skimmed from their laundered accounts over the past 3 years. Bradley tried to speak to formulate a pathetic legal defense or blame a fictitious hacker, but his throat was entirely sealed shut by raw, unadulterated terror. He could only let out a pathetic, wet whimper. The mafia boss chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that chilled the air in the room. He informed Bradley that stealing from the syndicate was not just a simple financial dispute. It was an extreme personal insult that required a highly visible and exceptionally painful public response. The boss promised Bradley that his death would not be quick or merciful. He vividly detailed how his enforcers were already turning their vehicles around, heading straight back to my suburban house. He promised they would keep Bradley alive for days, extracting their pound of flesh piece by broken piece. The call disconnected abruptly, leaving a sharp, harsh dial tone that sounded exactly like a flatlining heart monitor. The digital tone cut off, leaving the room in a heavy, terrifying silence. The absolute destruction of Bradley Sutton was finally complete. Every single ounce of his fabricated corporate persona, his expensive tailored suits, his arrogant legal posturing, and his delusional superiority complex completely evaporated. He was stripped down to nothing but raw, primal cowardice and an overwhelming, desperate instinct to survive the night. He collapsed entirely. His knees hit the hardwood floorboards with a heavy, sickening thud right at the tips of my worn boots. He lunged forward, grabbing handfuls of my denim jeans, burying his bruised and bloody face against my knees. He began to sob with violent, ugly, heaving gasps that shook his entire shattered frame. He begged me for help. He pleaded with me to use my federal cybersecurity connections to save him from the cartel enforcers. He wailed that he was sorry, that he was just a desperate fool, and that he would do absolutely anything I commanded if I just protected him from the men coming to skin him alive. Aaliyah watched the entire pathetic display from the shattered office doorway, her designer clothes covered in dust and her face frozen in absolute disbelief. The man she had conspired with, the husband she believed was a ruthless criminal mastermind capable of outsmarting her father, was currently reduced to a weeping, groveling infant begging for mercy. Her delusion of their shared superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I looked down at the sobbing, pathetic creature clutching my legs. I thought about the years I spent silently funding his failing law firm through Vanguard Holdings. I thought about how he took my anonymous charity to build a fake empire of arrogance and then actively hired armed assassins to murder me in my sleep so he could steal whatever was left. I felt absolutely zero pity for his impending doom. I looked at him with eyes as hard and cold as polished granite. I told him in a low, steady voice that the mafia enforcers were heavily armed and highly motivated. They would arrive at my front door in less than 10 minutes and he had absolutely nowhere to hide. I stated clearly that his only remaining chance of surviving this freezing winter night without being tortured to death was the heavily fortified safety of a federal maximum security prison cell. I reached into the front pocket of my flannel shirt and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I opened the encrypted voice recording application and pressed the bright red record button. I placed the device flat on the mahogany desk right next to the open laptop. I looked down at Bradley, forcing him to meet my cold, unwavering gaze. I laid out the final non-negotiable terms of his survival. If he wanted me to contact Derek and have the FBI secure him before the mob assassins arrived, he had to confess to everything right here and right now. I demanded the full, unvarnished truth recorded permanently on the digital record. Bradley did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. His overwhelming, paralyzing fear of the Chicago syndicate completely obliterated any remaining shreds of his legal training. He knew a lengthy federal prison sentence was infinitely better than facing the brutal, agonizing wrath of a betrayed mafia boss. He began to speak rapidly, his voice thick with heavy tears and dark blood. The words poured out of him in a frantic, desperate flood of self-preservation. He confessed to accessing the dark web to hire the 2 hitmen who broke into my home. He detailed exactly how he procured the specialized potassium chloride syringe specifically designed to simulate a massive, fatal heart attack during my sleep. He admitted to bribing Dr. Evans with a stolen $10,000 cash advance to forge the involuntary psychiatric evaluation. He confessed to aggressively destroying my home office, tearing open the floor safe, and committing deliberate arson by burning my handwritten will. Then, without a single ounce of hesitation, he turned his panicked eyes toward the doorway and threw his own wife directly to the wolves. He named Aaliyah as a fully willing and active co-conspirator. He detailed how she had helped him map out the timeline of my murder, providing him with the exact layout of the house and the schedule of my daily routines. Aaliyah shrieked in furious denial from the hallway, lunging forward to silence him, but Bradley shouted loudly over her, aggressively betraying the woman he had sworn to protect just to save his own miserable skin. He finished his frantic, comprehensive confession, completely breathless and utterly defeated. He slumped back onto his heels, looking up at me with wide, pleading, bloodshot eyes. He begged me to pick up the phone and make the call to the FBI immediately. He cried out that the enforcers were coming and they were completely out of time. I reached over to the mahogany desk and calmly pressed the stop button on the recording application. The heavy audio file was instantly saved and automatically uploaded to a secure, encrypted cloud server. I looked down at his terrified face and smiled a cold, ruthless, triumphant smile. I told him I did not need to make a desperate call to my son because I had already made the call hours ago. Right at that exact devastating moment, the pitch-black living room behind him was suddenly bathed in an aggressive, alternating strobe of bright red and blue light. The piercing flash of multiple police sirens swept violently across the shattered front windows, casting long, rapidly moving shadows over Bradley's horrified face. The heavy synchronized sound of multiple armored vehicles skidding to a halt on the frosty suburban street echoed loudly through the ruined house. The absolute authority of the law had officially arrived. The aggressive strobe of red and blue emergency lights sliced through the pitch-black living room, casting erratic shadows over Bradley's horrified face. He remained frozen on his knees, staring blankly at the shattered front entryway. The heavy, synchronized thud of combat boots stomping across the frosted front lawn signaled the absolute end of his miserable criminal reign. Before Bradley could even attempt to stand up or formulate another pathetic lie, the remaining glass of the large bay window exploded inward. A shower of sharp crystalline shards rained down violently across the hardwood floor, mixing with the bitter, freezing winter wind sweeping into the house. The reinforced front door, already severely damaged by the syndicate enforcers earlier, was violently kicked entirely off its metal hinges. A heavily armed FBI tactical team poured into the narrow hallway, moving with terrifying synchronized military precision. They wore thick Kevlar vests, ballistic helmets, and carried matte black assault rifles leveled directly at the center of the room. The blinding beams of their tactical flashlights cut through the dark smoke lingering from the burned parchment paper. At the very front of the tactical formation stood Derek. My oldest son stepped into the ruined house wearing his dark blue FBI windbreaker. He did not look like a concerned family member rushing to check on his elderly father. He moved with the cold, unyielding authority of a senior federal agent executing a high-level takedown. The tactical team immediately fanned out, securing every single exit and clearing the perimeter with rapid, aggressive commands. Bradley shrank back against the mahogany desk, raising his bloody, trembling hands high into the air. He tried to open his swollen mouth to speak, to beg for Derek to intervene and protect him from the approaching federal agents. I remained seated in my leather chair, watching my son execute his duties with flawless precision. Derek and I had coordinated this entire raid, utilizing the exact digital tracking data I had pulled from the corrupted Vanguard Holdings accounts. The FBI had sufficient probable cause to breach the premises the moment Bradley confessed on the hot microphone. Derek did not spare a single glance of familial recognition toward the pathetic, bleeding man cowering on the floor. He looked at Bradley strictly as a high-value federal target, a violent financial predator who had finally been trapped in a digital and physical corner. For 5 years, Bradley had strutted through family gatherings wearing imported Italian suits and boasting about his massive corporate success. He had looked down on Derek's government salary and mocked my modest lifestyle. He had arrogantly believed his legal degree made him untouchable. But in this exact devastating moment, all of his fabricated superiority was completely eradicated. Bradley tried to invoke his status as a lawyer, demanding to see a warrant, but his voice cracked weakly. Derek stepped forward, towering over the shivering lawyer. His voice was incredibly calm, but it carried the devastating weight of a falling executioner's blade. "Bradley Sutton, you are officially under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Derek announced, his words echoing sharply off the walls of the ruined home office. He did not recite the standard basic rights immediately. Instead, he systematically listed the crushing weight of the federal charges we had meticulously compiled over the past 48 hours. You are being charged with severe counts of aggravated money laundering, international wire fraud, and felony extortion. Derek took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance. Furthermore, based on irrefutable audio and digital evidence obtained within the last 24 hours, you are also being charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and the attempted assassination of a federally protected citizen. Bradley's eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. He finally realized the full scope of the massive surveillance net I had drawn around him. The federal government had been tracking his illegal mob transactions, his fake medical documents, and his dark web hitman contracts in real time. Derek reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick, folded legal document, tossing it aggressively onto the floor right next to Bradley's trembling knees. It was a comprehensive federal indictment signed directly by the United States Attorney General. It detailed every single dollar he had stolen from the Chicago syndicate, and every lethal chemical he had purchased to fake my heart attack. The cold, harsh reality of a lifetime locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary crashed down heavily on Bradley's fractured mind. He let out a loud, pathetic wail, dropping his face into his hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The untouchable corporate lawyer had been reduced to a weeping, desperate criminal. Derek stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic display with absolute cold, professional disgust. He gave a sharp, definitive nod to the two heavily armored tactical agents standing directly behind him. The two massive agents lunged forward instantly. They grabbed Bradley by his expensive torn suit jacket and slammed him brutally face down onto the hard wooden floorboards. The forceful impact knocked the remaining wind completely out of his lungs. An agent drove a heavy combat boot firmly between Bradley's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. He grabbed Bradley's wrists, wrenching them aggressively behind his back. The sharp, distinctive metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly into place echoed clearly in the room. Bradley let out a final, muffled gasp of defeat as the cold metal bit deeply into his skin. While Bradley was being violently subdued in the office, Aaliyah realized her own imminent destruction. She had been standing frozen in the hallway, but the sight of the FBI agent snapping the cuffs onto her husband triggered her raw survival instinct. She turned around abruptly and sprinted frantically toward the kitchen. She had previously stashed a heavy leather travel bag packed tightly with emergency cash and stolen jewelry inside the pantry, hoping to use it if she ever needed to abandon Bradley. She grabbed the heavy bag and bolted directly for the rear patio door, desperately hoping to slip away into the dark, freezing backyard. She managed to yank the glass door open, but she did not make it a single step outside. 2 female tactical agents were already holding strict positions on the back deck. They moved with lightning speed. One agent grabbed Aaliyah firmly by the shoulder of her designer jacket, spinning her around aggressively. The second agent swept Aaliyah's legs out from under her with a swift, brutal kick. My daughter slammed hard onto the freezing wooden deck, dropping the heavy leather bag. The stolen cash spilled out slightly across the frost-covered planks. The agents pinned her instantly, snapping a pair of steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Aaliyah shrieked wildly, demanding they let her go, screaming that she was a victim and that her father would protect her. The agents completely ignored her frantic, entitled tantrums, hauling her forcefully to her feet without a shred of sympathy. The tactical agents dragged both Bradley and Aaliyah roughly through the shattered front entryway of my house. They pulled them forcefully down the concrete steps toward the massive black armored transport vehicles idling aggressively on the street. The blinding strobe of emergency lights illuminated their complete public humiliation. The quiet suburban neighborhood had completely transformed into a chaotic media spectacle. Derek had deliberately tipped off the local news stations, ensuring this massive federal raid was broadcasted live to the entire city. Dozens of local reporters and aggressive photojournalists had already crowded against the yellow police barricades blocking the street. The rapid, blinding flashes of dozens of professional cameras fired continuously, lighting up the dark winter night like rapid gunfire. Neighbors stepped out onto their front porches, wrapping their robes tightly around themselves and watching in absolute shock as the wealthy, successful couple was hauled away in chains. Bradley hung his head, trying desperately to hide his swollen, bloodied face from the relentless camera lenses. Aaliyah continued to scream and thrash wildly, completely destroying whatever remained of her pristine high society reputation. They were being publicly paraded as the miserable, violent criminals they truly were, facing the flashbulbs with absolutely nowhere left to hide. 1 month had passed since the blinding red and blue strobe lights of the FBI tactical vehicles illuminated my ruined front lawn. The freezing winter winds had given way to a bitter, damp chill, but the atmosphere inside the federal maximum security penitentiary was infinitely colder. The sterile concrete walls and heavy steel doors of the visitation center were meticulously designed to strip away every remaining ounce of human dignity. I walked shoulder to shoulder with my ruthless corporate attorney, Jonathan Reyes. Our heavy footsteps echoed sharply down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor, a relentless marching beat of impending justice. We were not here to offer comfort or forgiveness. We were here to finalize the absolute destruction of a monster. The federal government had successfully isolated Bradley Sutton from the general prison population strictly for his own physical protection. The Chicago crime syndicate had already placed a massive, lucrative bounty on his head the very second my digital embezzlement files became public knowledge. He was a dead man walking, waiting for the inevitable execution. The federal prosecutors had granted him a highly restrictive face-to-face meeting to discuss his desperate 11th-hour plea for a reduced sentence. Jonathan carried a sleek, black leather briefcase holding the finalized legal documents that would permanently sever Bradley from any remaining shred of hope. We passed through 3 separate, heavily armed security checkpoints before being allowed into the restricted block. We entered the small, claustrophobic visitation room and took our seats on the hard, bolted metal chairs. The thick, bulletproof glass separated us from the prisoner side of the facility, a solid, transparent barrier between my absolute freedom and his eternal captivity. I folded my hands calmly on the cold metal counter, breathing steadily and waiting for the man who had orchestrated my assassination to be dragged into the light. A heavy iron door on the opposite side of the thick glass buzzed loudly and slid open with a harsh, aggressive mechanical grind. 2 massive correctional officers escorted Bradley into the sterile room. The sight of him was deeply pathetic. The slick, arrogant corporate lawyer who once wore imported Italian suits and boasted relentlessly about his limitless wealth was entirely gone. He was wearing an oversized, bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his rapidly thinning, malnourished frame. His face was deathly pale and gaunt, his dark hair greasy and receding from the extreme stress. The dark purple bruised circles under his bloodshot eyes revealed weeks of profound sleep deprivation driven by the constant terrifying paranoia of an impending mafia hit inside the prison walls. He sat heavily on the metal stool, picking up the black plastic telephone receiver with shaking, clammy hands. I picked up my receiver, slowly maintaining a cold, unyielding gaze that offered absolutely zero quarter. Bradley tried to force a pathetic, broken smile, trying desperately to invoke a sense of familial sympathy that had been dead for months. He began speaking in a rapid, trembling voice, instantly launching into a highly calculated psychological manipulation. He did not start with a genuine apology. He started with an aggressive barrage of pathetic, cowardly excuses. He claimed he was a victim of immense societal pressure and extreme clinical depression. He whined that the highly competitive corporate law environment had crushed his spirit and forced him into making desperate, irrational financial choices just to survive. He blamed the ruthless Chicago syndicate for actively terrorizing him into a state of blind panic. He even had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to blame my daughter. He claimed Aaliyah was a financially abusive, narcissistic monster who constantly demanded diamond necklaces and luxury vacations, forcing him to borrow illegal money to keep her satisfied. He painted himself as a tragic hostage of circumstance, a fundamentally good man who simply made a few terrible mistakes under unimaginable duress. I listened to his miserable whining without blinking a single time. Jonathan sat perfectly still beside me, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute legal indifference. Bradley finally reached the core purpose of this pathetic meeting. He leaned closer to the scratched glass, his ragged breath fogging the transparent surface. He proposed a desperate, cowardly plea agreement. He offered to testify aggressively against Aaliyah, throwing her completely under the bus for the murder conspiracy, the financial fraud, and the mafia money laundering. He promised to hand the federal prosecutors every single piece of evidence regarding her active involvement in the assassination plot, ensuring she received the maximum possible sentence. In exchange, he begged me to formally request leniency from the federal judge and use my massive offshore wealth to secure him a reduced sentence in a white-collar minimum security facility where the cartel assassins could not reach him. He pleaded that he could still be a useful legal asset to me if I just showed him a fraction of the mercy he had violently denied me on that freezing winter night. He truly believed his fabricated tears and his willingness to sacrifice his own wife would somehow purchase his salvation. I let his pathetic, cowardly words hang heavily in the stale prison air. The silence stretched out agonizingly long, forcing him to drown slowly in his own desperate anxiety. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of human sympathy. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the exact nature of this visit, Bradley," I stated, my voice resonating through the plastic receiver with the crushing weight of a falling steel anvil. "I did not come here to negotiate with a cornered rat. I came here to look you directly in the eyes and watch you realize that your entire existence is completely over. You brought armed hitmen into my home. You ordered a lethal chemical injection for a sleeping man. You actively destroyed your own life, and now you arrogantly expect me to purchase your comfort." I nodded sharply to Jonathan. The ruthless attorney unclasped his black leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp legal document printed on heavy stock paper. He slid it flat against the bulletproof glass so Bradley could read every single word clearly. It was an irrevocable permanent order of total disinheritance and absolute financial severance. It legally certified that neither Bradley nor Aaliyah would ever receive a single penny of my $14 million estate, regardless of any future legal challenges. It explicitly blocked them from ever making a medical, legal, or financial claim on my behalf, stripping away their status as family members entirely. The document completely severed all familial ties, rendering them absolute legal strangers to me in the eyes of the law. Bradley stared at the bold black text, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer absolute horror. The microscopic shred of hope he had desperately clung to instantly vaporized into thin air. I told him coldly that I would not spend a single dime to downgrade his prison sentence or protect him from the consequences of his own monumental greed. I wanted him placed directly in the maximum security general population, where he would have to look over his shoulder every single second of every single day, waiting for the syndicate to finally collect their overdue blood debt. The devastating reality of his permanent impending doom finally shattered his fragile mind completely. Bradley dropped the plastic receiver, allowing it to swing wildly from its metal cord, and slammed both of his trembling fists violently against the thick bulletproof glass. He screamed incoherently, his face twisting into a hideous mask of pure primal terror and impotent rage. Thick spit flew from his mouth as he pounded relentlessly against the barrier, demanding that I come back and save him. The two massive correctional officers instantly lunged forward, grabbing him roughly by his orange collar and dragging him forcefully away from the window. He kicked and thrashed wildly, but his weakened body was no match for their sheer physical strength. Jonathan Reyes calmly packed the severance document back into his pristine briefcase, snapping the metal locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. He leaned toward the glass panel, locking his cold, predatory eyes with the screaming, thrashing prisoner. "We do not accept plea deals from arrogant amateurs," Jonathan announced, his voice echoing with absolute freezing legal authority. "We will see you at the public trial." I turned my back on the screaming traitor and walked toward the exit without a single ounce of hesitation, letting the heavy steel doors close firmly behind us. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal a massive room thick with a suffocating, undeniable tension. The day of the highly publicized public trial had finally arrived, drawing an enormous crowd of local journalists, curious onlookers, and stern-faced federal agents who packed the wooden benches to absolute maximum capacity. The stifling atmosphere in the gallery was incredibly dense, buzzing with hushed, frantic whispers and the rapid mechanical clicking of reporters' pens. I walked slowly down the center aisle, wearing my best dark charcoal suit, moving with the deliberate, unwavering grace of a man who had already secured his ultimate victory. Jonathan Reyes walked closely beside me, carrying the heavy black leather briefcase that held the digital keys to my daughter and son-in-law's absolute, permanent destruction. We took our seats behind the prosecution table, facing the elevated, polished wooden bench where the federal judge would soon preside over the legal slaughter. The jury box was completely full, featuring 12 ordinary citizens, looking on with intense, morbid curiosity. Their eyes darted back and forth between the imposing federal prosecutors and the defense table, where Bradley and Aaliyah sat miles apart from each other. They were both dressed in conservative, muted clothing, a pathetic, transparent attempt to project an image of respectable humility to the court. Bradley stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him, his posture completely defeated, and his shoulders slumped. He looked deathly pale and was visibly trembling, terrified of the syndicate assassins he firmly believed were waiting for him in the general prison yard. Aaliyah sat rigidly staring straight ahead and refusing to make any eye contact whatsoever with the man she had conspired with to murder me. The bailiff called the sprawling courtroom to order, and the heavy thud of the judge's gavel echoed sharply, signaling the official beginning of the end. The lead defense attorney, a slick, expensive professional hired with the very last remnants of Aaliyah's hidden credit lines, stood up to deliver his opening statement. He paced slowly and methodically in front of the jury box, utilizing a soft, theatrical voice meticulously designed to elicit maximum unwarranted sympathy from the courtroom. He attempted to paint a highly fabricated, deeply insulting picture of Bradley as a tragic, helpless victim of intense corporate pressure and severe psychological breakdown. The defense argued passionately that Bradley was a fundamentally good man who simply got in way over his head with dangerous loan sharks and made a series of desperate, irrational choices to protect his family from violent mafia retribution. He tried to spin the attempted murder as a tragic misunderstanding, claiming there was never any real intent to harm me physically, just a misguided, clumsy plan to secure a temporary medical guardianship for my own supposed well-being. The lawyer went as far as suggesting that I was a domineering, secretive father who had intentionally set a cruel financial trap for a struggling young couple, pushing them to the absolute brink of insanity. It was a masterful display of expensive legal fiction, but it was entirely built on a fragile foundation of blatant lies. Jonathan Reyes did not object or interrupt the sickening performance. He sat perfectly still, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad, simply waiting for the defense to finish digging their own massive grave. When it was finally time for the prosecution to present their core evidence, Jonathan stood up and approached the center of the courtroom with the confidence of a lethal apex predator. He did not rely on cheap emotional appeals or theatrical pacing. He simply requested formal permission from the federal judge to introduce Exhibit A directly into the official court record. With a sharp, definitive nod of approval from the bench, Jonathan connected a sleek digital tablet to the courtroom's central audio system. He instructed the jury to listen very carefully to the exact true nature of the so-called tragic misunderstanding. He pressed play on the high-definition audio file I had secretly recorded on the night the armed hitmen breached my front door. The crystal-clear digital audio crackled slightly before broadcasting Aaliyah's vicious, impatient voice through the heavy overhead speakers. The entire courtroom listened in dead silence as she aggressively barked at her husband, demanding to know why it was taking so long to handle one sleeping old man. The recording played her ruthless complaints about freezing in her luxury car while waiting to play the grieving, devastated daughter. It captured Bradley's frantic, terrified whispers as he realized the bed was empty, followed immediately by Aaliyah's cold-blooded command to find me and finish the job without any more pathetic excuses. The sheer, raw malice and premeditated cruelty echoing through the speakers completely obliterated the defense attorney's fabricated narrative of a desperate, struggling family man. A collective gasp of pure, unadulterated horror rippled violently through the packed gallery. The sheer magnitude of the cold-blooded betrayal stunned the entire room into a state of profound shock. Several members of the jury visibly recoiled in their seats, their faces twisting in absolute disgust as they processed the chilling reality of a daughter explicitly ordering the cold-blooded execution of her own elderly father. The slick defense attorney slumped back into his chair, heavily massaging his temples as his entire expensive legal strategy vaporized into thin air right before his eyes. He knew instantly that absolutely no jury in the country would ever acquit a pair of calculating murderers after hearing that damning tape. In a desperate final attempt to salvage her own rapidly sinking ship and avoid a lifelong prison sentence, Aaliyah's independent legal counsel called her directly to the witness stand. She walked up to the wooden podium, clutching a crumpled tissue and putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. The second she took the solemn oath, she burst into violent theatrical sobs. She looked directly at the jury and immediately threw her husband completely under the bus. She claimed she was absolutely terrified of Bradley, stating that he was a violent, abusive monster who forced her to participate in the financial fraud and the assassination plot against her will. She wept loudly, swearing that she never actually wanted me dead and that she only made those aggressive comments on the phone because Bradley had threatened her life if she did not comply with his insane mafia-driven demands. She painted herself as a helpless, terrified hostage manipulated by a gambling addict heavily indebted to a ruthless criminal syndicate. Bradley stared at her from the defense table, his jaw dropping in sheer absolute betrayal. The fragile alliance they had built on greed imploded publicly. He lunged forward aggressively, cursing at her and calling her a lying snake before the heavy hands of the federal marshal slammed him forcefully back into his seat. Aaliyah's desperate, cowardly testimony left the courtroom in a state of chaotic, shocked murmurs. She desperately hoped her fabricated tears and her willingness to sacrifice her husband would somehow earn her the jury's sympathy and a reduced sentence. The federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, aggressively demanding absolute order in the court before the proceedings could continue. The defense attorney, looking completely out of options and sweating profusely under the intense fluorescent lights, requested to call their final witness to the stand in a last-ditch effort to cross-examine the primary victim. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. The bailiff called out my name, reading it clearly into the official federal record. I stood up slowly from the prosecution table, buttoning my dark charcoal suit jacket with steady, calm hands. I walked deliberately toward the elevated witness box, my posture perfectly straight and my gaze fixed forward. I turned and looked directly at the defense table, my eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a freshly sharpened sword. I raised my right hand and placed my left palm flat against the worn leather cover of the Bible. The court bailiff asked if I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I replied with a single resonant statement. I do. My voice echoed loudly across the cavernous courtroom, cutting through the stifling tension like a heavy steel blade. I sat down in the wooden witness chair and adjusted the microphone. I looked directly across the room at the defense table. Bradley was actively shaking, unable to maintain any semblance of composure. Aaliyah sat slightly apart from him, clutching a crumpled tissue, still attempting to project the pathetic image of a battered, terrified wife. There was absolutely no mercy left in my heart. The father who had carried her on his shoulders, who had worked grueling double shifts to pay for her privileged life, had died on the dusty floorboards of an attic while armed hitmen hunted him. The man sitting on the witness stand was a hardened survivor demanding absolute justice. The lead federal prosecutor approached the podium asking me to state my name and relationship to the defendants for the official court record. I stated my full name clearly. I then pointed a steady, unwavering finger toward the defense table and announced that the two individuals sitting there were the architects of my attempted assassination. I did not soften my words or offer any diplomatic phrasing. I set the tone immediately, ensuring the jury understood that this was not a tragic familial misunderstanding, but a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy driven by pure, unadulterated greed. The prosecutor expertly guided me through the exact chronological timeline of their monstrous betrayal. I spoke methodically, ensuring every single member of the jury could follow the complex web of financial deceit. I started by completely dismantling Bradley's fabricated image as a highly successful corporate attorney. I revealed the existence of Vanguard Holdings, the anonymous blind trust I had established using my $14 million cybersecurity patent. I explained how I had secretly funded his failing law firm for 5 years, pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into his operating accounts just to keep my daughter comfortable. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the gallery. Bradley's fragile ego was publicly eviscerated. I detailed how he had squandered that anonymous charity, racking up a massive $5 million blood debt with a ruthless Chicago crime syndicate. I explained that when the mafia demanded immediate payment, he and Aaliyah decided that murdering me and liquidating my modest brick house was their only viable exit strategy. But I did not simply offer verbal testimony. I brought undeniable physical and digital proof. The prosecutor submitted a heavy stack of certified bank statements into the federal record. These documents clearly showed the exact moment I terminated Vanguard Holdings, instantly freezing Bradley's fraudulent empire. Then we moved to the events following the botched assassination attempt. I described how Bradley, desperate and cornered, had violently broken into my private home office. The defense attorney stood up to object, claiming this was mere hearsay without physical evidence. I smiled coldly at the slick lawyer. The prosecutor immediately introduced a new digital exhibit. The large monitors in the courtroom flickered to life, displaying a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed. The jury watched in absolute stunned silence as the footage from the hidden camera tucked inside my golden engineering trophy played on the screens. They saw Bradley physically smash his way into my office. They watched him violently tear open my floor safe and pull out my handwritten last will and testament. They saw the ugly, twisted mask of pure hatred on his face as he realized he had been entirely cut out of the estate. And finally, they witnessed him commit deliberate felony arson using a silver butane lighter to burn the legal document to ashes inside a crystal bowl. The video evidence was absolutely irrefutable. It completely destroyed any lingering doubt about his malicious intent and criminal desperation. I then explained how I had used my cybersecurity expertise to route his final desperate wire transfer directly to the mafia boss, attaching a comprehensive digital dossier detailing his 3-year embezzlement scheme. Bradley buried his face in his hands, weeping openly as his ultimate doom was laid bare for the entire world to see. With Bradley thoroughly destroyed, the prosecutor turned the focus to the woman sitting quietly at the end of the defense table. Aaliyah looked up at me, her eyes wide and brimming with fresh, manufactured tears. She was desperately hoping that her earlier testimony playing the victim of a violent, abusive husband had somehow swayed my resolve. She hoped the biological bond of father and daughter would somehow force me to show her leniency on the stand. My gaze swept over her, taking in her expensive designer clothing and her carefully practiced expression of fragile innocence. I addressed the jury directly, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. I told them about the night the hitmen breached my front door. I recounted how I had hidden in the freezing attic listening to my own daughter on speakerphone. I repeated her exact words for the court record, ensuring the jury heard how she had viciously complained about waiting in the cold and aggressively ordered her husband to finish the job without excuses. Aaliyah shook her head violently, mouthing the word no, but she could not hide from the truth. I looked directly into her eyes, stripping away her pathetic victimhood entirely. I stated firmly that she was not a hostage and she was not coerced. She was an active, willing participant who eagerly traded her father's life for a diamond necklace and a first-class ticket to a luxury lifestyle. I told the court that the greed inside her soul had consumed every ounce of her humanity, turning her into a cold-blooded predator. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring my final declaration echoed in every corner of the massive room. I announced that the woman sitting at that table was nothing more than a violent stranger to me. I officially and completely disowned her, rejecting my status as her father right there on the federal record. The psychological blow struck Aaliyah with devastating physical force. She let out a sharp, agonizing wail, her entire body collapsing forward as the absolute reality of her permanent isolation and impending imprisonment finally crushed her fabricated reality. The slick defense attorney did not even attempt to cross-examine me. He remained seated, staring blankly at his legal pad, fully aware that any further questioning would only inflict more catastrophic damage on his clients. The prosecution rested its case, leaving a heavy, undeniable atmosphere of absolute guilt hanging over the room. The federal judge, a stern man with decades of experience on the bench, leaned forward and banged his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. He instructed the 12 members of the jury to retire to the deliberation room to carefully weigh the overwhelming mountain of evidence presented before them. As the jury filed out silently, the heavy wooden doors closing firmly behind them, the remaining energy completely drained from the defense table. Bradley slumped forward entirely, defeated, his forehead hitting the heavy wooden desk with a dull, hollow thud. He knew his life was officially over. The heavy wooden doors of the deliberation room swung open much sooner than anyone anticipated. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes had passed since the 12 men and women were instructed to weigh the mountain of evidence. In the realm of federal justice, a 2-hour deliberation for a multi-million-dollar financial fraud and a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder meant only one thing: absolute, overwhelming, unquestionable guilt. A sudden, suffocating hush fell over the packed gallery as the jurors filed back into their designated box. The chaotic murmurs of the reporters and the hushed whispers of the onlookers died instantly. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could shatter glass. Bradley raised his bruised and pale face from the heavy wooden defense table, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically toward the jury, trying desperately to read their expressions. They refused to look at him. Not a single juror spared a glance toward the defense table. They kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, a universal sign of condemnation. Aaliyah sat rigidly beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as she realized her theatrical tears had failed to manipulate anyone. I remained seated at the prosecution table next to Jonathan Reyes, my posture perfectly straight and my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. The federal judge entered the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him, and took his seat at the elevated bench. He looked down at the jury foreperson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who held a folded piece of white paper. The judge asked if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. She stood up, her voice steady and resolute, confirming that they had. The absolute silence in the room deepened, pressing down on my daughter and her husband like a physical, crushing weight. The court clerk took the folded white paper from the foreperson and handed it directly to the federal judge. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the document briefly before handing it back to be read into the official court record. I watched Bradley's chest completely freeze. His lungs simply forgot how to function. The clerk cleared his throat and began to read the devastating sequence of legal conclusions that would permanently end 2 miserable lives. On the first count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant, Bradley Sutton, guilty. The words struck the room like a physical blow. Bradley let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, gripping the edge of the table as if the floor was dropping out from under him. The clerk continued without a single ounce of mercy, reading through the massive list of federal violations. On the counts of international wire fraud, aggravated money laundering, and felony extortion, we find the defendant guilty on all charges. The financial empire he had violently tried to protect, the arrogant corporate facade he had built with my stolen money, was officially and legally obliterated. He was legally branded a violent financial predator and a convicted mastermind of an assassination plot. The clerk then turned to the second page of the verdict sheet, addressing the woman sitting completely paralyzed at the end of the defense table. Aaliyah squeezed her eyes shut tightly as if pretending to be asleep could somehow alter reality. On the count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder as an active accomplice, the jury finds the defendant, Aaliyah Sutton, guilty. She violently flinched as the word hit her. On the counts of accessory to wire fraud and attempting to defraud a federal financial institution, we find the defendant guilty. The meticulously constructed lies she had spun on the witness stand, her pathetic attempts to play the abused, terrified hostage, had completely failed to deceive the 12 ordinary citizens in the jury box. They saw right through her expensive designer clothes and her manufactured tears straight into the dark, greedy core of her soul. She was not a victim. She was a fully willing conspirator who actively priced her own father's life at $5 million just to maintain her luxury status. The sheer magnitude of their legal destruction settled heavily over the defense table. The federal prosecutors sitting next to me nodded silently to each other, their monumental case successfully closed. Jonathan Reyes did not smile or gloat. He simply closed his legal pad, placing his expensive pen down in a gesture of absolute finality. The jury had spoken with a unified, deafening voice. The meticulous digital traps I had set, the hidden surveillance cameras, the rerouted mafia wire transfers, all of it had culminated in this exact, flawless execution of absolute justice. There were no loopholes left for a slick corporate lawyer to exploit. There were no sympathetic ears left for a greedy daughter to manipulate. They were entirely at the harsh, unforgiving mercy of the federal court system, and that mercy did not exist today. The federal judge did not delay the sentencing phase. He looked down at the defense table with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. He stated clearly for the official record that in his 30 years on the federal bench he had rarely witnessed such a sickening display of premeditated familial betrayal and raw financial greed. He addressed Bradley first, outlining the sheer brutality of hiring armed assassins to inject a sleeping elderly man with lethal chemicals. For the heinous crimes of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and orchestrating a massive international financial fraud, the judge's voice boomed through the courtroom microphones. I sentence you, Bradley Sutton, to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a violent, definitive crack. Bradley collapsed entirely. His legs gave out completely, and he slid out of his chair, landing heavily on his knees, weeping loudly and uncontrollably into his handcuffed hands. The untouchable lawyer was completely erased. The judge then shifted his piercing gaze toward Aaliyah. He told her that her active willingness to facilitate the cold-blooded murder of the father who had sacrificed his entire life for her privilege was a crime of unfathomable moral bankruptcy. He stated that her betrayal was a fundamental violation of human decency. For your role as a fully active accomplice in the conspiracy to commit murder and severe financial fraud, I sentence you to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Another deafening crack of the heavy gavel sealed her absolute doom. Aaliyah's fragile reality shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply as the federal marshals moved in aggressively to haul them both away to the holding cells. She fought violently against the officers, dragging her expensive leather boots across the polished hardwood floor. She twisted her body around, desperately searching the gallery until her wide, terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. "Dad!" She shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent courtroom in a raw, agonizing wail. "Please, Dad, help me! Do not let them take me!" Her desperate, pathetic scream echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the courtroom, a final, miserable plea from a monster who suddenly realized the true catastrophic cost of her greed. The federal marshals yanked her forcefully toward the heavy side doors, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical tears. I stood up slowly from the prosecution table, buttoning my dark charcoal suit jacket with steady, calm hands. I looked at her, thrashing and screaming my name, but I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, unconditional paternal love I once held for her had been completely eradicated, permanently burned away on the dusty floorboards of my freezing attic. I turned my back to the defense table, entirely severing my visual connection to her pathetic existence. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my posture perfectly straight and my steps measured and deliberate. I did not pause. I did not falter. I did not look back over my shoulder a single time. The toxic poison that had infected my family had been thoroughly and legally excised. The absolute purge was finally complete. 3 months had passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom sealed the absolute fate of the two monsters who tried to destroy my life. The bitter, freezing winter had finally surrendered to a bright, crisp spring, bringing with it a profound sense of renewal and total closure. I stood on the sidewalk of my quiet suburban street, looking at the modest brick house I had called home for over 40 years. A bright red and white sign was hammered firmly into the front lawn, declaring the property officially sold. I had just handed the keys over to a young couple eager to start their own family, completely unaware of the dark, violent history embedded in the floorboards. The house simply held too many ghosts. It was the place where I had tirelessly raised a daughter who eventually put a precise price tag on my head. It was the exact location where armed hitmen had breached my front door, and where a cowardly, corrupt lawyer had held a loaded gun to my temple. I did not want to spend my remaining years surrounded by the suffocating echoes of their monumental greed. Liquidating the property was a highly necessary surgical extraction to remove the final infected remnants of my past. I watched the large moving truck drive away, carrying the very last of my carefully selected belongings down the street. I did not feel a single ounce of nostalgia or regret as I turned my back on the brick facade. I walked toward my newly purchased vehicle, leaving the physical remnants of my fabricated poverty behind me forever. The miserable chapter of playing the vulnerable, oblivious old man was officially closed. I slid into the driver's seat of my heavy-duty truck, gripping the leather steering wheel with steady, calloused hands. I put the vehicle in drive and pulled away from the curb without checking the rearview mirror even once. I drove 60 miles outside the claustrophobic city limits, leaving the towering concrete skyline far behind. My destination was a sprawling, sun-drenched property nestled deep in the rolling green hills of the tranquil countryside. I had purchased a massive 50-acre equestrian farm featuring a beautiful wraparound porch, a state-of-the-art engineering workshop, and acres of open, pristine land. The air here smelled of fresh pine and blooming wildflowers, a stark, dramatic contrast to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the corporate law firms and federal prisons that had defined my harsh winter. But the farm was not the only massive change in my daily life. With Bradley and Aaliyah permanently locked away inside the federal penitentiary system, the strict tactical necessity for my absolute financial secrecy had vanished entirely. I contacted Jonathan Reyes and instructed him to officially declassify my hidden assets. The intricate network of blind trusts and offshore holding companies was meticulously and legally dismantled. The $14 million fortune generated by my cybersecurity patent was finally brought into the light, safely transferred into my direct public control. However, I had absolutely zero intention of hoarding the massive wealth or squandering it on meaningless, flashy luxury. My agonizing experience with my treacherous daughter and her criminal husband had exposed me to a dark, terrifying reality operating in the shadows of society. Across the country, there were thousands of elderly men and women suffering in absolute silence, victims of aggressive financial exploitation and physical abuse at the hands of their own greedy relatives. They were isolated, vulnerable, and completely stripped of their legal rights by the very people they trusted most. They did not have federal agents on speed dial or hidden millions to fight back against their vicious abusers. I decided to change that immediately. I utilized $10 million of my newly unsealed fortune to establish a powerful, uncompromising nonprofit organization. I named it the Vanguard Senior Defense Alliance. I hired a relentless team of top-tier litigation attorneys, ruthless private investigators, and dedicated social workers. Our singular mission was to provide aggressive, high-level pro bono legal representation to elderly victims facing domestic financial fraud and forced institutionalization. We built an impenetrable legal shield for the vulnerable, actively hunting down predatory family members and corrupt medical professionals who preyed on the weak. The foundation became an immediate, formidable force in the legal community. Every single time our lawyers stepped into a courtroom, they carried the exact same unyielding iron resolve I had used to crush Bradley's criminal empire. I channeled the profound betrayal I experienced into a relentless weapon for absolute justice, ensuring that no other aging parent would ever have to face the terrifying darkness of familial exploitation alone. It was a remarkably peaceful Sunday afternoon, bathed in the warm golden light of the late spring sun. I was standing by the heavy wooden fence of the horse paddock wearing a comfortable pair of denim jeans and a light cotton shirt. The distinct crunch of tires on the long gravel driveway announced the arrival of my weekend guests. Derek pulled his sturdy dark SUV up to the front of the farmhouse. My oldest son stepped out of the vehicle, shedding his intense, imposing FBI persona the exact moment his boots hit the dirt. He was wearing a casual jacket and a wide, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. His beautiful wife stepped out from the passenger side, unbuckling their two energetic young boys from the back seat. The kids immediately hit the ground running, their joyous, high-pitched laughter echoing brightly across the wide open acres of the farm. They sprinted directly toward me, wrapping their small arms tightly around my legs and shouting for their grandfather. I knelt down and hugged them back fiercely, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of pure, unfiltered joy. This was what true family actually felt like. It was not built on financial expectation, toxic obligation, or hidden resentment. It was built on a solid foundation of absolute mutual respect and genuine unconditional love. Derek walked over and pulled me into a firm, strong embrace. He did not ask me for money or inquire about the status of my will. He simply asked how my week had been, and if I needed any help building the new wooden deck I had been designing for the back of the house. We spent the entire afternoon grilling food on the open patio, sharing old stories and watching the children chase the farm dogs across the lush green grass. The dark, terrifying shadows of the hired hitmen, the poisoned orange juice, and the federal courtroom felt like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. The suffocating poison that had infected my bloodline had been completely drawn out and permanently neutralized, leaving only the healthy, thriving roots behind. As the vibrant orange and purple hues of the sunset began to paint the expansive evening sky, Derek and his family packed up their vehicle to head back to the city. I waved goodbye from the porch, watching their taillights disappear down the long, winding driveway until the farm was enveloped in a comforting, quiet serenity. I walked back to the patio table and picked up my ceramic mug, taking a slow, deep sip of the strong black coffee. The bitter, rich taste grounded me perfectly in the present moment. I rested my forearms against the wooden railing and directed my gaze toward the majestic purple mountains rising in the far distance. The heavy burden of betrayal, the constant hypervigilance, and the painful facade of the weak old man had been entirely washed away by the cool mountain breeze. My heart was completely untroubled, my conscience was flawlessly clear, and my spirit was fiercely proud. I had successfully defended my life, secured my legacy, and transformed my darkest nightmare into a powerful beacon of justice for others. The war was officially over, and my new life had truly begun. Looking back on the entire ordeal, I realized a fundamental truth about human nature. People often mistake silence for ignorance and kindness for weakness. Bradley and Aaliyah looked at my gray hair and faded clothes and saw nothing but an easy target. They failed to understand that the quietest people usually have the sharpest minds. Age does not diminish your worth or your ability to fight back against those who seek to exploit you. True strength lies in setting absolute boundaries and having the courage to walk away from toxic bloodlines to protect your own peace. If my story gave you the courage to stand up against betrayal, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.